Some men are born to save lives. Others are destined to fail when it matters most. Grant Holloway was both, and the desert was about to give him one last chance at redemption. In the scorching heart of Arizona Territory, 1875, a Confederate medic-turned-rancher will discover a dying woman and her daughter abandoned in a wasteland where hope goes to die. What begins as a desperate rescue will ignite a battle against corrupt law, family greed, and the ghosts of his own failures. This is a story of three broken souls forging an unbreakable bond. Stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Arizona sun didn't forgive, it punished. Grant Holloway had learned that truth the hard way over 7 years of ranching this godforsaken stretch of territory where even the cacti seemed to lean away from the heat, as if trying to escape their own shadows. The landscape was a study in browns and grays, dust, rock, and the bleached bones of things that had made the mistake of dying out here. Everything was coated in a fine layer of grit that got into your clothes, your food, your very soul if you stayed long enough. He'd stayed long enough. His gelding, a sturdy buckskin named Soldier, picked his way along the narrow trail that cut through the chaparral like a scar through leather. Grant kept his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit, more than necessity. Nobody came out this way. That's why he'd chosen it. The main road to Tucson lay 15 miles north, and the nearest town, if you could call Miller's Crossing a town, was a 2-hour ride south. Out here, a man could hear his own thoughts too clearly, which was either a blessing or a curse depending on what those thoughts contained. For Grant, it was usually a curse. The war had ended 10 years ago, but some battles never stopped. He could still see the field hospital tent, the rows of screaming boys, because that's what they'd been, just boys playing at soldiers, and the inadequate supplies that made him feel more like a butcher than a healer. He'd saved dozens, maybe hundreds, but the ones who haunted him weren't the ones he'd saved. They were the ones he'd lost. Soldier's ears suddenly pricked forward, swiveling like compass needles seeking true north. Grant's hand instinctively moved to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, his body tensing. The horse had better instincts than most men he'd known. If Soldier sensed something, there was something to sense. Then he heard it. Faint, fragile, a sound so out of place in this wilderness that for a moment his mind couldn't categorize it. A child's voice. Crying. Grant's heart kicked against his ribs like a colt fighting a rope. He urged Soldier forward, the gelding responding immediately, hooves clattering over loose stones as they rounded a bend in the trail. The crying grew louder, more distinct, high-pitched, ragged, desperate. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water despite the 100-degree heat. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, stood in the middle of the trail, about 50 yards ahead. She was barefoot, wearing what had once been a pale blue dress, now stained brown with dust and darker stains he didn't want to identify. Her hair hung in tangled blonde knots around a face burned red by the sun. But it wasn't the girl that stopped Grant's breath. It was what she was doing. She stood over a collapsed woman, holding a stick, a pathetic little branch no thicker than Grant's thumb, brandishing it like a sword at the world. The woman lay motionless on the ground, one arm flung out, face down in the dirt. The girl's sobs came in gasping waves, and as Grant drew closer, he could make out her words. "Go away! Go away! That's my mama! You can't have her! She's just sleeping! She's just sleeping!" The child's voice cracked on the last word, raw and desperate. Grant's medical instincts, dormant for so long they'd calcified into something hard and cold inside his chest, suddenly roared back to life with the force of a flash flood. He dismounted before Soldier had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground hard. "Easy there, little one," he called out, keeping his voice soft, his movements slow. The girl whirled toward him, raising her stick higher, her blue eyes wild with terror and determination. She couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds soaking wet, and the desert had clearly been working on her for hours, maybe days. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her small arms covered in scratches. "Stay back!" she shrieked, though her voice barely rose above a hoarse whisper. "My mama's just sleeping. She told me to guard her. I'm guarding her." "I know you are, sweetheart. You're doing a real good job." Grant stopped about 10 feet away, crouching down to make himself smaller, less threatening. His eyes, however, were locked on the woman on the ground. She wasn't moving, not even the slight rise and fall of breath. "My name's Grant. What's yours?" "Rosie," the girl whispered, then seemed to catch herself, as if she'd given away a secret. "Rosie Marsh. And that's my mama, Lydia. She's just tired. She's just resting." Grant could see it now, the way the woman's fingers curled slightly into the dirt, the almost imperceptible tremor that ran through her body. Not dead. Not yet. But close. Dangerously close. "Rosie, I'm a doctor." It was a lie, or close enough to one. He'd been a medic, not a physician, but this child didn't need technical distinctions. She needed hope. "I help people who are tired. I help them wake up. Will you let me help your mama wake up?" The girl's stick wavered. Her chin quivered. "You promise you'll help her? You promise you won't take her away?" Something in those words, the specific phrasing, sent a chill through Grant despite the heat. Won't take her away. As if someone had tried. As if this child had been running from something. "I promise I'll help her," Grant said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "But I need to get close to her, Rosie. I need to touch her to help her." "Is that all right?" For a long moment, the little girl just stared at him with those huge, sunburned eyes. Then, slowly, the stick lowered. Her small body swayed, and Grant realized with a jolt that the child was about to collapse herself. He moved fast, covering the distance in 3 long strides. He caught Rosie just as her knees buckled, scooping her up with one arm while dropping to his knees beside the woman, beside Lydia. Up close, it was even worse than he'd thought. The woman's skin was gray-tinged, her lips cracked and bleeding like her daughter's. Dehydration. Severe. Her dress was torn, her arms covered in defensive wounds, scratches, bruises in various stages of healing. This wasn't just someone who'd gotten lost. This was someone who'd been running hard. Grant pressed 2 fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. There. Faint. Thready. Irregular. But there. Her skin was burning up, but not from the sun. This was fever, the kind that killed more reliably than bullets. "Rosie," he shifted the little girl in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. "Rosie, honey, I need you to stay awake for me. Can you do that?" A tiny nod against his chest. "Good girl. Your mama's very sick. She has a fever. Do you know what that means?" "She's hot," Rosie whispered. "She was hot last night, too. She was saying things that didn't make sense. About Uncle Vernon, about running. She said we had to keep running." Uncle Vernon. Another piece of the puzzle, though Grant didn't have time to assemble it now. He glanced around, his mind racing. The sun was directly overhead. High noon, the worst possible time to be stuck in the open. They needed shade. They needed water. They needed both immediately. His eyes landed on a cluster of rocks about 20 yards off the trail, creating a small overhang. Not much, but better than nothing. And Soldier, bless him, stood patient and steady despite the drama, his saddlebags laden with supplies. Grant had learned long ago to always ride prepared. The desert didn't give second chances to the unprepared. "All right, Rosie, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to carry your mama to those rocks over there where there's shade. Then I'm going to get water and medicine from my horse. Can you be brave for me? Can you help?" "I can be brave," Rosie whispered, though tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. "Mama says I'm the bravest girl in the whole world." "I believe her," Grant said softly. Then, still cradling Rosie in one arm, he managed to work his other arm under Lydia's shoulders. The woman was dead weight, which made the task exponentially harder. But he'd carried wounded soldiers through worse terrain. He gritted his teeth and heaved her up, draping her across his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Every step toward that rocky outcropping felt like a mile. The sun beat down like a physical weight, and Grant could feel sweat pouring down his back, soaking his shirt. Rosie clung to him, her small fingers digging into his shirt, her face buried against his neck. "Is Mama gonna die?" The question came out so small, so broken, that it nearly unmade him. Grant's sister Eleanor had asked him that same question 10 years ago in a makeshift hospital tent as infection ravaged her young body. He'd lied to her then, told her everything would be fine, told her he'd fix it. He hadn't been able to fix it. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she doesn't, he told Rosie now. And this time he didn't lie. He didn't promise. He just told her the truth. They reached the overhang, and Grant carefully lowered Lydia to the ground in the precious strip of shade. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her face slack. Not good. Not good at all. He set Rosie down beside her mother, watching the little girl immediately curl up against Lydia's side, one small hand clutching her mother's sleeve. "Stay here," Grant ordered, already moving. "Stay in the shade. I'll be right back." He actually ran, back to Soldier, yanking his canteen from where it hung on the saddle horn. He grabbed his bedroll, his medical kit, such as it was, and a spare shirt from his saddlebags. His mind was cataloging symptoms, running through treatments, pulling up memories from field hospitals where he'd learned to work miracles with almost nothing. Dehydration, fever, possible infection. She needed fluids. She needed cooling. She needed antibiotics, which he didn't have, so he'd have to rely on willow bark tea and prayer. He'd prayed before. It hadn't helped. But he prayed anyway as he hurried back to the overhang. Rosie had draped herself across her mother's chest, her ear pressed against Lydia's heart, listening. When Grant knelt beside them, the girl looked up at him with eyes full of a terror no child should ever have to feel. "Her heart's still beating," Rosie whispered, "but it sounds funny, all fast and jumpy." "That's the fever," Grant explained gently, uncorking his canteen. "We're going to fix that. First, we need to get some water into her. Can you help me sit her up a little?" Together, a grizzled rancher and a 4-year-old girl, they managed to prop Lydia into a semi-sitting position against the rock wall. Her head lolled to one side, and for a moment Grant thought she might be too far gone to swallow. But when he dribbled a tiny amount of water onto her cracked lips, her tongue moved reflexively, licking at the moisture. "That's it," he murmured. "Come on, Lydia. Just a little more." He worked slowly, patiently, getting drops of water into her mouth, watching her throat to make sure she swallowed, careful not to give too much too fast. Beside him, Rosie watched with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. "Is that helping?" the girl asked. "Every drop helps," Grant assured her. "Now, I need to cool her down. That fever's cooking her from the inside out." He soaked his spare shirt in water from the canteen, precious water, but there was no choice, and began pressing the wet fabric to Lydia's forehead, her neck, her wrists. The woman stirred slightly at the touch, a small moan escaping her lips. "Mama!" Rosie leaned forward, her small hands grasping at her mother's dress. "Mama, wake up! Please wake up!" Lydia's eyes moved beneath her closed lids, but didn't open. Her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear. Grant leaned closer. "What's she saying?" "She keeps saying, 'Run,'" Rosie whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "She's been saying it since yesterday. 'Run, Rosie. Keep running. Don't let them find us.'" There it was again. Them. Someone this woman and her child were running from. Someone dangerous enough to drive them into the desert to die rather than be caught. Grant filed that information away. Right now, the only enemy that mattered was death, and he'd be damned if he let it win. Not this time. He worked for the next hour in that sliver of shade, cooling Lydia's fever-racked body, getting water into her one painful drop at a time. Rosie stayed glued to her mother's side, sometimes helping, sometimes just watching, sometimes drifting into an exhausted doze before jerking awake in panic. "Sleep," Grant told her gently. "I'll watch your mama. I promise." But what if she wakes up and I'm not here?" Rosie's voice cracked. "What if she thinks I left her?" "She won't think that," Grant said with more certainty than he felt. "She'll know you're right here. You're her brave girl, remember? Brave girls need rest, too." Finally, as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Rosie's exhaustion won. She curled up against her mother's side and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that only children and the utterly spent could achieve. Grant kept working. He mixed willow bark powder from his medical kit with water, creating a bitter tea that he managed to get down Lydia's throat in small sips. He continued the cooling treatments. He checked her pulse every few minutes, still weak, but maybe, just maybe, a tiny bit stronger. As the shadows lengthened and the oppressive heat finally began to ease, Grant allowed himself a moment to really look at the woman he was trying to save. Even ravaged by fever and exposure, there was a refined quality to her features. High cheekbones, a straight nose, hands that beneath the cuts and blisters were slender and graceful. This wasn't a woman born to the rough frontier life. The quality of her dress, though torn and filthy, spoke of money, of breeding, of a world far removed from Arizona deserts and desperate flights from unnamed pursuers. "Who are you, Lydia Marsh?" Grant murmured. "And what the hell are you running from?" As if in answer, Lydia suddenly gasped, her body convulsing. Grant's hands were on her immediately, steadying her, turning her on her side as her stomach heaved. Nothing came up. She was too dehydrated for that, but the dry heaving racked her body with painful spasms. Rosie woke with a cry. "Mama!" "It's all right," Grant said quickly, though it wasn't all right at all. This level of illness needed more than field medicine and hope. It needed a real doctor, real medicine, a real hospital. But the nearest doctor was in Miller's Crossing, 2 hours away, and he seriously doubted Lydia would survive the journey in her current state, which meant they'd have to stay here, in the open, in the dark, in territory where predators, both animal and human, prowled. Grant looked up at the darkening sky, then back at the two fragile lives that had been dropped into his care by whatever cruel twist of fate enjoyed its ironic jokes. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to his unconscious patient or her terrified daughter. "All right, we do this the hard way." He spent the next hour as the sun set preparing their makeshift camp. He retrieved Soldier, tethering the gelding close enough to provide warning if anything approached, but far enough that the horse's natural nervousness wouldn't disturb the sick woman. He built a small fire using dead chaparral branches, carefully controlled, more for psychological comfort and boiling water than warmth. He laid out his bedroll and spread his coat over Lydia's shivering form, because now, as night fell and the desert cold crept in to replace the punishing heat, Lydia had started to shake. The fever was breaking, which should have been good news, except that the temperature swings were so extreme they could kill her just as surely as the fever itself. "She's shaking," Rosie whimpered, pressed against her mother's side, trying to share body heat with her small frame. "Why is she shaking?" "Her body's fighting the sickness," Grant explained, adding another piece of wood to the fire. "The shaking means she's getting better, but we need to keep her warm now instead of cool." He gathered Rosie up, despite her protests, and settled her more firmly against Lydia's side, then positioned himself on Lydia's other side, creating a barrier of body heat. It was improper as hell, lying beside a strange woman, but propriety had no place in survival situations. He'd learned that in the war, too. The stars came out, impossibly bright in the clear desert sky. A coyote called in the distance, and Soldier shifted nervously, but nothing approached their small circle of firelight. Grant fed the flames carefully, conserving his limited fuel, and kept one hand on Lydia's wrist, monitoring her pulse through the long, dark hours. Rosie talked, her small voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the night too much. "We used to live in a big house," she said. "Mama played the piano. I had a room with dolls, pretty dolls with china faces." Her voice caught. "But then Papa died, and Uncle Vernon came. He said he was family. He said he'd take care of us. But Mama was scared of him. I could tell." She smiled at him, but her smiles were the wrong shape, like they hurt her face to make. Grant listened, saying nothing, letting the child unburden herself. "Then Uncle Vernon said he wanted Mama to marry him. He said it was proper. But Mama cried at night. I heard her. And one morning, we left. We took a train, and then a stagecoach, and then we were walking. Mama said we had to get somewhere safe, somewhere Uncle Vernon couldn't find us." The girl's voice dropped even lower, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "But he did find us, 3 days ago. He had men with him, bad men. Mama made me hide in some bushes, and she ran the other way, making noise so they'd chase her. I heard shouting. I heard—" She swallowed hard. "I heard Mama scream, but then everything got quiet. And when I came out, Mama was sitting on a rock, and she was bleeding. She was bleeding, but she grabbed my hand and we ran again. We ran, and then Mama got hot. And then she couldn't run anymore, and then I found you," Grant finished softly. Rosie nodded against her mother's shoulder. "Are you really going to help her? Or are you like Uncle Vernon? Are you going to take us back?" The question hung in the air, weighted with more than a 4-year-old should have to carry. Grant thought about his sister Eleanor, thought about how helpless he'd been as she'd slipped away despite his every effort, thought about how he'd come to this isolated ranch specifically to avoid ever feeling that helplessness again. Thought about how much easier it would be to take these two into Miller's Crossing in the morning, hand them over to the sheriff, and walk away clean. Thought about how he couldn't do that. Couldn't walk away. Not from a little girl with her mother's blood on her hands and terror in her eyes. Not from a woman who'd chosen the desert over whatever waited for her back in that big house with the piano and the china-faced dolls. "I'm not taking you back anywhere you don't want to go," Grant said, and felt the words settle into his bones like an oath. "You hear me, Rosie? You and your mama are under my protection now. Anyone who wants to hurt you has to go through me first." "Even Uncle Vernon?" "Especially Uncle Vernon." Rosie's small hand found his across her mother's still form and squeezed. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert, feeling the woman between them slowly stabilizing. Her breathing deepened, her pulse grew stronger, the shaking subsided into occasional shivers. "Tell me about your ranch," Rosie said suddenly. "Is it nice?" Grant considered the question. His ranch was isolated, rough, barely profitable. The house was more of a cabin, weathered and worn. The land was harsh, the life was harder. "It's got a stream that runs year-round," he said instead, "and a big oak tree that's got to be 100 years old. Sometimes birds nest in it, lots of birds. And the sunsets?" He paused, trying to find words for something he'd only ever experienced in silence. The sunsets turned the whole sky purple and gold, like someone spilled paint across the clouds. "That sounds nice," Rosie murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "Can we see it?" "Yeah," Grant heard himself say. "Yeah, we can see it." The child fell asleep holding his hand, her small fingers wrapped around two of his like a lifeline. Grant stayed awake, feeding the fire, monitoring Lydia's breathing, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. This was madness. He knew nothing about these people. Lydia could be a criminal. This Uncle Vernon could be perfectly legitimate. Taking them to his ranch could bring trouble down on his head, the kind of trouble a man living alone specifically moved to the middle of nowhere to avoid. But none of that mattered when weighed against the memory of Rosie standing over her fallen mother with a stick, declaring that she was just sleeping, her small voice fierce with desperate hope. None of it mattered when Grant's fingers felt that thread-thin pulse in Lydia's wrist and remembered every soldier, every patient, every life he'd fought to save. None of it mattered because, for the first time in 10 years, Grant Holloway felt like he might be able to save someone that mattered. And if he failed, well, he'd been living with failure for a decade already. What was one more ghost? But he wouldn't fail. Not this time. "I've got you," he whispered into the desert night, unsure if he was talking to Lydia, to Rosie, or to himself. "I've got you both, and I'm not letting go." The fire crackled. The stars wheeled. The desert held its breath. And somewhere in the darkness, Lydia Marsh's fever finally began to break. Grant woke to birdsong and the smell of dawn, that particular scent of cooling sand and warming air that marked the desert's transition from night to day. He dozed fitfully, never quite fully asleep, always aware of the two people depending on him. Rosie was still curled up in a small ball against her mother, snoring softly. And Lydia. Lydia's eyes were open. Grant's heart stuttered. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the cold ashes of the fire. A strange man and a woman who'd nearly died, connected by nothing except chance and a little girl's desperate need. Then Lydia's eyes widened in panic. She tried to sit up, her mouth opening to scream, but all that came out was a hoarse croak. Her hand flew to Rosie, pulling the sleeping child against her chest protectively. "Easy," Grant said, holding up both hands, making himself as unthreatening as possible. "Easy, ma'am. You're safe. You're both safe." "Who?" Lydia's voice came out like gravel, painful to hear. "Who are you? What?" "My name's Grant Holloway. I found you and your daughter on the trail yesterday around noon. You were unconscious, severe dehydration and fever. I've been treating you." Lydia's eyes darted around the camp, taking in the location, the dying fire, Grant's bedroll, his horse grazing nearby. Her arms tightened around Rosie. "You found us." It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I found you dying," Grant clarified. "Your daughter was trying to protect you with a stick." At that, something cracked in Lydia's expression. She looked down at Rosie, still sleeping against her chest, and her face transformed, fear giving way to anguished love. Her hand trembled as she stroked her daughter's tangled hair. "How long?" she whispered. "About 18 hours. Your fever broke a few hours before dawn. You've been sleeping naturally since then." Lydia closed her eyes, and Grant saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer of thanksgiving. When she opened them again, some of the panic had receded, replaced by a wary calculation. "Did he send you?" "Did who send me?" "Vernon." The name came out like poison. "Vernon Rusk. Did he send you to find us?" "Lady, I don't know any Vernon Rusk. I was riding my usual patrol route when I heard your daughter crying, that's all. I'm not sent by anybody except maybe bad luck and worse timing." Lydia studied his face, and Grant had the uncomfortable sensation of being read like a book. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because some of the tension bled out of her shoulders. "I need water," she said hoarsely. Grant handed her his canteen, watching as she drank in small, careful sips. Good, she knew not to gulp, before offering it to Rosie, who had started to stir. "Mama?" The girl's voice was fuzzy with sleep. Then her eyes snapped fully open. "Mama, you're awake! You're awake! You're awake!" She bounced up and down, making Lydia wince. "Gently, baby girl," Lydia murmured, but she was smiling through obvious pain. "Mama's still a little weak." "Grant fixed you," Rosie announced proudly. "He gave you medicine and water and kept you warm all night. I helped." "You did help," Grant confirmed. "You were very brave." Lydia's eyes met his over her daughter's head, and in them Grant saw a complexity of emotion he couldn't begin to untangle. Gratitude, suspicion, fear, hope, all mixed together like storm clouds. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving our lives." "You're not out of danger yet," Grant said bluntly. "You need real rest, real food, and at least a week of recovery before you should even think about traveling. You understand? Your body's been through hell." "We can't stay." Lydia's voice turned sharp, urgent. "We have to keep moving. Vernon, he'll have people looking for us. If they find us, then they'll have to deal with me," Grant interrupted. "And I don't deal easy." Mother and daughter both stared at him. Lydia's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "You don't understand. Vernon Rusk he's wealthy, powerful. He has connections, lawyers, men who'll do whatever he tells them. We're nothing to him except property he thinks he owns. You can't." "I can," Grant said flatly, "and I will. Now here's what's going to happen. I'm taking you both back to my ranch. It's about 3 hours from here. You'll stay there until you're strong enough to travel properly. Then, if you still want to run, I'll help you do it right. Supplies, money, a head start that actually means something. But right now, you go anywhere on foot, you'll be dead in a day. You go on horseback in your condition, maybe 2 days. Is that what you want for your daughter?" Lydia's arms tightened around Rosie. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not what I want." "Then trust me, just for a little while. Trust that I'm not working for this Vernon person, and I'm not interested in whatever his claim on you might be. I'm just a man who doesn't like seeing women and children die in the desert, especially not when I can prevent it." "Why?" Lydia's eyes bored into his. "Why would you help us? What do you get out of this?" Grant thought about that, about Eleanor, about the men he'd saved and the ones he'd lost, about the nightmares that still woke him some nights, smelling phantom blood and gangrene, about the hollow feeling in his chest that had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. "Maybe I don't want another ghost," he said simply. Something in Lydia's expression softened. "I know something about ghosts," she said quietly. "Then we understand each other." Grant stood, his knees protesting the movement. He wasn't as young as he used to be. "Can you ride?" Lydia tried to stand and immediately swayed. Grant caught her arm, steadying her, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She'd been a strong woman once, he could tell, but hunger and fear and sickness had worn her down to nearly nothing. "I can ride," she said stubbornly. "No, you can't. You'll ride with Rosie in front of me. Soldier can carry all 3 of us for a few hours." That's not proper, Lydia protested weakly. Despite everything, Grant felt a smile tug at his mouth. Ma'am, we spent the night lying beside each other to keep you from dying of exposure. Propriety left the building yesterday. A faint blush colored Lydia's pale cheeks. Thank you. For that. For everything. Thank me when you're well, Grant said. Now, let's get you both home. Home. The word surprised him. His ranch had never felt like home, just a place to exist. But somehow, with these two broken souls looking at him with hope in their eyes, it suddenly seemed like it could be something more, something worth protecting. He helped Lydia onto Soldier, settled Rosie in front of the saddle, and swung up behind them. The gelding snorted, but took the extra weight without complaint. Good old Soldier, reliable to the end. As they rode away from that rocky overhang where they'd spent the long night fighting death, Rosie twisted around to look at Grant. Are you an angel? She asked seriously. Mama says angels come when you need them most. Grant thought about all the ways he'd failed to be angelic, all the lives he hadn't saved, all the darkness he carried. No, sweetheart, he said. I'm just a man. Well, Rosie said, settling back against her mother with a satisfied air, you're the best just a man I ever met. Behind her, Lydia was crying quietly, and Grant pretended not to notice. They rode east toward the rising sun, toward a ranch house that suddenly felt like it might be full of purpose again, toward a future none of them could predict but all of them desperately needed. And in the growing light of morning, Grant Holloway made himself a promise. Whatever came next, whatever threats, whatever dangers, whatever ghosts from these women's past showed up on his doorstep, he would be ready. He'd failed once before to protect someone he cared about. He wouldn't fail again. The Holloway Ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a low-slung adobe structure with a tin roof that caught the morning sun, surrounded by scrub brush and the skeletal remains of what had once been ambitious fencing. Grant felt Lydia tense in front of him as they drew closer, her body going rigid with either exhaustion or renewed fear. Rosie, by contrast, sat up straighter, her small hands gripping the saddle horn. Is that it? The girl asked. Is that your house? That's it, Grant confirmed. Not much to look at, but it keeps the rain out. Mostly. It's wonderful, Rosie breathed, and Grant nearly laughed at the pure wonder in her voice. The child had clearly lowered her standards significantly over the past few days. They crossed what passed for a yard, mostly dirt with a few stubborn patches of buffalo grass that refused to die, and Grant brought Soldier to a stop near the front porch. The gelding stood steady as Grant dismounted, then carefully lifted Rosie down before helping Lydia. Her legs nearly buckled the moment her feet touched ground, and Grant caught her around the waist, supporting most of her weight. I've got you, he said quietly, and felt her lean into him, too exhausted to maintain her pride. I can walk, she protested, but her voice was thin as paper. Sure you can. In about a week. Grant adjusted his grip, essentially carrying her up the 3 steps to the porch. Rosie scampered ahead, pushing open the door, unlocked, because who the hell would rob a place this isolated, and disappearing inside. Mama, there's a real bed, her voice echoed from within. A real bed with blankets. Grant carried Lydia through the doorway and into what served as his main living space, kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all combined into one open area dominated by a massive stone fireplace. It was sparse but clean, or at least as clean as a bachelor rancher's home could be. The bedroom was off to the left, and that's where Grant headed, Lydia's weight barely registering against his frame built from years of hard labor. The bed was unmade. He'd left in a hurry yesterday morning, but the sheets were clean enough. Grant lowered Lydia onto the mattress as gently as he could, watching her sink into it with a sigh that sounded like it came from her very soul. Real bed, she echoed her daughter, and her eyes were already drifting closed. Sleep, Grant ordered. Rosie and I will be right outside. You're safe here. Safe, Lydia murmured, the word barely audible. Haven't been safe in so long. Within seconds, she was unconscious again, her body surrendering to the exhaustion Grant had been keeping at bay through sheer willpower and medical intervention. He stood watching her for a moment, this woman who'd stumbled into his life with her desperate daughter and her mysterious threats, and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. Is Mama going to be okay? Rosie appeared at his elbow, her small face tilted up to his with those enormous blue eyes. She's going to be fine, Grant said, and this time he believed it. She just needs rest, lots and lots of rest. Come on, let's let her sleep. He ushered Rosie out of the bedroom, closing the door softly behind them. The girl stood in the middle of his living area, looking lost and small and utterly out of place in this rough bachelor's quarters. Grant's heart gave an uncomfortable squeeze. Are you hungry? He asked. Rosie's nod was so vigorous her whole body moved. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. But not soldier, she added quickly. Soldier's nice. Grant couldn't help the smile that cracked his face, the first genuine smile he'd felt in longer than he could remember. Well, I don't have horse on the menu anyway. How about eggs and bread? And maybe some bacon? Yes, please, Rosie whispered, her eyes going wide. We haven't eaten in, I don't remember, days maybe. Mama gave me her food. She said she wasn't hungry, but I think she was lying. Of course she was lying. Grant had seen it 1,000 times, mothers sacrificing everything, even their own survival, for their children. The war had been full of such stories, women starving themselves to feed their babies, walking barefoot so their children could have shoes. He moved to the kitchen area, stoking up the stove, still warm from breakfast, which felt like a lifetime ago, and pulling out supplies. Rosie followed him like a shadow, watching his every movement with fascination. Can I help? She asked. You can set the table. Plates are in that cupboard there, forks and knives in the drawer below. Rosie set about her task with serious concentration, carefully placing 2 plates on the rough wooden table, arranging the silverware with precision. Grant cracked eggs into his cast-iron skillet, the sizzle and pop of bacon filling the small space with homey smells that made the place feel less empty than usual. They ate in silence at first, Grant watching with satisfaction as Rosie demolished her eggs and bacon with single-minded intensity. He'd given her a smaller portion deliberately, knowing that after days of near starvation, too much food too fast would make her sick. When she looked up hopefully for more, he shook his head. In an hour, you can have more. Right now, your stomach needs to remember how to work. Mama says that too, Rosie said. Then her lower lip trembled. Mama says lots of things. She's smart, my mama. She used to be a nurse. Did you know that? Before she married Papa, she was training to be a nurse. But then Papa's family said it wasn't proper for a lady to work, so she had to stop. Grant filed that information away. Another piece of the puzzle that was Lydia Marsh. A nurse. That explained her daughter's basic understanding of fevers and heartbeats. That explained the intelligence he'd seen in those fever-bright eyes before she'd lost consciousness. Your Papa, Grant said carefully. What happened to him? Rosie's face clouded. He died last year. He was riding a horse, and it threw him, and he hit his head. Mama said he died right away, that he didn't feel any pain, but she cried for days and days. And then Uncle Vernon came to the funeral, and he didn't leave. He said he was there to help us, but Mama didn't want his help, I could tell. This Uncle Vernon, Grant probed gently, he's your Papa's brother? Yes, but he's nothing like Papa. Papa was kind. Papa read me stories and taught me to ride his old mare. Papa made Mama laugh. Rosie's voice dropped to a whisper. Uncle Vernon made Mama cry. He'd say nice things when other people were around, but when it was just us, he'd say mean things. About how Mama couldn't take care of the estate properly. About how a woman needed a man to guide her. About how it was only natural that he should marry her and take care of everything. Grant's jaw tightened. He'd known men like this Vernon Rusk, men who saw women and children as property to be managed, assets to be controlled. The war had been full of them too, officers who treated their men like cattle and wondered why desertions ran so high. Your Mama didn't want to marry him, Grant said. It wasn't a question. No, she said. She said she'd rather die in the desert than let him touch her. Rosie's eyes filled with tears. And we almost did die in the desert, didn't we? If you hadn't found us, we would have died. Grant reached across the table and took one of Rosie's small hands in his. But I did find you, and you didn't die, and neither did your Mama. You're here now and you're safe. But for how long? The question came out in a rush, as if Rosie had been holding it back and could no longer contain it. Uncle Vernon has lots of money, lots of men who work for him. He told Mama that no matter where she ran, he'd find her. He said she belonged to the Rusk family now. He said I belonged to the Rusk family. He said he'd take me away from Mama if she didn't cooperate. And there it was, the threat that had driven Lydia Marsh to flee into the desert with her daughter. Not just her own safety, but her child's. Grant understood that kind of desperation. He'd seen soldiers throw themselves on grenades to save their squad. He'd seen medics run into active fire to drag wounded men to safety. Maternal instinct was no different, just as fierce, just as willing to sacrifice everything. Listen to me, Rosie. Grant squeezed her hand gently. Your uncle doesn't own you or your mama. Nobody owns another person. That's not how the world works, no matter what he says. And if he tries to take you, he'll have to go through me first. You understand? But you're just one man, Rosie said, her voice small. And he has lots of men. I'm one man who's very good at being stubborn, Grant said. And I've been in worse fights than this. Trust me on that. Rosie studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. I trust you. You saved Mama. That means you're good. If only it were that simple, Grant thought. If only saving one life could wash away all the ones he'd failed to save. But he didn't say that to Rosie. He just squeezed her hand again and stood up. Come on, let me show you around while your mama sleeps. The tour didn't take long. The ranch wasn't exactly sprawling. Besides the main house, there was a barn that housed Soldier and 2 milk cows, a chicken coop with a dozen laying hens, a small smokehouse, and a well that Grant was quietly proud of because he'd dug the damn thing himself and it had never run dry. Rosie took it all in with wide eyes, asking a million questions that Grant answered with more patience than he knew he possessed. By the time they circled back to the house, the sun was high and hot, and Rosie was swaying on her feet despite her earlier nap. Grant scooped her up without asking permission. She weighed nothing, just bones and determination, and carried her back inside. I'm not tired, Rosie protested, even as her head drooped against his shoulder. Course you're not, Grant agreed. You're just resting your eyes. He settled her on the old sofa near the fireplace, covering her with a blanket that had seen better days. Within moments, the girl was asleep, one thumb creeping toward her mouth in a gesture that was achingly young. Grant stood watching her, this child who'd appointed herself guardian of her dying mother, who'd faced down the desert with nothing but a stick and determination. She reminded him painfully of Eleanor, not in looks, but in that fierce spirit that refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. He couldn't save Eleanor, but maybe, just maybe, he could save Rosie and Lydia. The thought had barely formed when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Grant's hand went instinctively to his rifle, which was propped near the door. He glanced at Rosie, still sleeping, then moved to the window, careful to stay out of direct sight while he looked out. 3 riders. Well-dressed, city men, judging by their clothes and the way they sat their horses. One of them was pulling something from his saddlebag, papers it looked like, legal papers. Grant's gut clenched. That was fast. Too fast. Either Vernon Rusk had incredible reach, or he'd already had men looking for Lydia and Rosie in this area. Either option was bad. The riders pulled up in front of the house. The one with the papers, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the officious air of a lawyer, dismounted and straightened his coat before approaching the porch. "Hello, the house," he called out. "I'm looking for Mr. Grant Holloway. Are you home, sir?" Grant considered his options. He could pretend he wasn't here, but Soldier was in the barn, smoke was coming from the chimney, and these men didn't look like they'd be easily discouraged. Better to meet the threat head-on. He opened the door but kept his rifle prominently displayed, not pointing at anyone but definitely visible. "I'm Holloway. What do you want?" The lawyer's eyes flickered to the rifle, then back to Grant's face. "Mr. Holloway, my name is Edmund Price, attorney at law from Phoenix. I represent the Rusk estate. I'm looking for a woman named Lydia Marsh and her daughter Rosie. We have information suggesting you may have encountered them on the trail." "What makes you think that?" Grant asked, his voice carefully neutral. Price smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Holloway, we've been tracking Mrs. Marsh for several days. We know she and her daughter were headed in this direction. We also know they were in desperate straits, no supplies, no water, traveling on foot in dangerous country. Given that you're the only ranch within 20 miles of where they were last spotted, It stands to reason you might have come across them. And if I did, then I need you to surrender them into my custody immediately. Mrs. Marsh is unwell, mentally unwell. She's been making wild accusations against the Rusk family, specifically against her late husband's brother, Vernon Rusk, who has been nothing but generous in his attempts to care for her and the child. We have court documents declaring her an unfit mother and granting custody of the minor child to Mr. Rusk as next of kin. Price held up the papers, waving them slightly as if their mere existence proved his case. This is all perfectly legal, Mr. Holloway. Mrs. Marsh has no legal right to keep the child. If you're harboring them, you're breaking the law. Grant's finger tightened on the rifle. That's quite a story. You mind if I read those documents myself? Price's smile stiffened. I assure you they're in order. Now if you'd just... I said, Grant interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. I'd like to read them myself. For a moment, the lawyer looked like he might refuse. Then he caught something in Grant's expression, something that suggested refusing would be a very bad idea, and climbed the porch steps, holding out the papers. Grant took them, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. He wasn't a lawyer, but he'd learned to read military orders and medical documents during the war, and he could parse enough to get the gist. What he saw made his blood boil. The documents claimed Lydia Marsh had been evaluated by a physician, Dr. Harold Crane of Phoenix, and found to be suffering from female hysteria and delusional thinking. They claimed she'd threatened violence against Vernon Rusk. They claimed she was a danger to herself and her child. And on the basis of these claims, a judge in Phoenix had granted temporary custody to Vernon Rusk pending a full hearing. It was all very official, all very legal, and all, Grant suspected, complete horseshit. This doctor who evaluated her, Grant said slowly, Dr. Crane. He's not by any chance on the Rusk estate payroll, is he? Price's expression flickered. Dr. Crane is a respected physician. That's not what I asked. The Rusk family does retain Dr. Crane for various medical needs, yes, but that doesn't... And this judge who signed off on this. Grant jabbed a finger at the signature. Judge Morrison. He wouldn't happen to owe the Rusk family any favors, would he? Any campaign contributions? Any personal loans? Price's face flushed. Mr. Holloway, you're making serious accusations. I'm asking questions. You're the one getting defensive. Grant folded the papers and held them back out. Here's what I think, Mr. Price. I think Vernon Rusk wants his brother's wife and his brother's child because they represent his brother's estate. I think he's using legal manipulation to get what he wants. And I think you're here doing his dirty work because you're too much of a coward to admit you're helping him steal a child from her mother. Price snatched the papers back, his face now bright red. You have no idea what you're talking about. Vernon Rusk is a pillar of the community. He's trying to save that child from a mother who dragged her into the desert to die. Or maybe, Grant said quietly, Lydia Marsh ran into the desert because dying there was preferable to what Vernon Rusk had planned for her. This is absurd, Price sputtered. If you're harboring them, you're breaking the law. I can have the sheriff here within... The sheriff from Miller's Crossing? Grant interrupted. Sam Fletcher? We served together in the war. He knows me. He knows I don't harbor criminals. So you go ahead and fetch Sam if you want. But I guarantee you, when he hears the full story, he's not going to be taking your side. It was a bluff, but a good one. Grant did know Sheriff Fletcher, though they weren't exactly friends. But Price didn't know that. The lawyer's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he seemed to collect himself, his expression hardening into something ugly. Let me make this very clear, Mr. Holloway. Vernon Rusk is a powerful man. He has resources you can't imagine. If you stand in his way, he will crush you. He'll tie you up in legal proceedings for years. He'll bankrupt you. He'll make your life a living hell. All over a woman and child who aren't even your family. Is that really worth it? Grant smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. You know what I learned in the war, Mr. Price? I learned that bullies only have power if you're afraid of them, and I stopped being afraid of anything the day I watched my 14-year-old sister die because I couldn't save her. So you go back to Vernon Rusk and you tell him this. Lydia and Rosie Marsh are under my protection now. If he wants them, he can come get them himself. But he better bring a lot more than lawyers and court documents. Price stared at him, mouth open, apparently speechless. Behind him, his two companions, hired muscle, by the look of them, shifted uneasily. They probably hadn't expected a lone rancher to stand up to them so directly. "You're making a mistake," Price finally managed. "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life," Grant said. "This isn't one of them. Now get off my land." For a moment, he thought Price might try something stupid. The lawyer's hand twitched toward his coat, and Grant's rifle came up a fraction of an inch, not pointing, just suggesting. Price froze. "That would be very unwise," Grant said softly. Price's hand moved away from his coat. "This isn't over." "No," Grant agreed. "I don't expect it is. But this conversation is. Get off my land." The three men mounted up, Price's face still flushed with anger and humiliation. As they turned their horses, Price called back one last threat. "You have 3 days, Holloway. 3 days to come to your senses and surrender them voluntarily. After that, we'll be back with the law. Real law, not your war buddy sheriff, and then you'll have no choice." Grant watched them ride away, keeping the rifle ready until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he lower it, his shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline drained away. "Grant?" He turned to find Lydia standing in the bedroom doorway, one hand braced against the frame for support. She looked like death warmed over, pale, shaking, barely able to stand, but her eyes were alert and focused. "You heard," Grant said. Not a question. "I heard." Lydia's voice was stronger than it had been earlier, though still rough. "He found us! God, he found us already!" "You need to be in bed," Grant said, moving toward her. "You're not strong enough." "I'm strong enough to know what this means," Lydia interrupted, pushing away from the doorframe and taking 2 shaky steps into the room. "Vernon has court documents. He has lawyers. He has power. And you—" She looked at Grant with something like despair. "You just made yourself an enemy of one of the most powerful families in the territory. Why? Why would you do that for us?" Grant considered the question, why indeed? He'd asked himself the same thing as he'd faced down Price and his men. The smart play would have been to hand Lydia and Rosie over, wash his hands of the whole mess, go back to his quiet, lonely existence. But he'd already learned that smart and right weren't always the same thing. "Because your daughter stood over you with a stick and told the world you were just sleeping," Grant said simply. "Because you chose to die in the desert rather than let that man have her. Because I'm tired of walking away from fights that matter. Take your pick." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "He'll destroy you. He destroyed my husband's business partner when the man questioned a contract. He destroyed a judge who ruled against him in a land dispute. He has resources, connections, money, and I have this land, a working rifle, and a very strong dislike for bullies," Grant said. "Plus 3 days to figure out how to beat him." 3 days, Lydia repeated hollowly. "That's not enough time, even if we ran again." "You're not running." The words came out harder than Grant intended. "Not until you're well, and maybe not even then. Running didn't work the first time, did it? He found you anyway." "So what do you suggest?" Lydia's voice cracked. "That we just wait here for him to come back with more men, more legal documents? Maybe a whole army next time?" "No," Grant said slowly, an idea forming in the back of his mind. It was crazy. It was desperate. It might not even work, but it was better than nothing. "I suggest we fight him the same way he's fighting us, with the law." Lydia laughed, but it was bitter. "The law is on his side. You saw those documents. A judge declared me unfit." "A judge he probably bought, based on an evaluation from a doctor he pays," Grant countered. "But not all judges are corrupt, and there are laws that even Vernon Rusk has to follow." "What are you saying?" Grant took a deep breath, hardly believing what he was about to propose. "I'm saying we need to make it legally impossible for him to take Rosie. We need to make it so that even his pet judges can't help him." "How?" "Marriage," Grant said. "You marry me. Right now, you're a widow. Your late husband's family has a legal claim through blood, but if you're married to someone else, that changes everything. Rosie would have a legal stepfather. Vernon's claim as next of kin becomes void, and any custody proceedings would have to go through both of us, not just you." Lydia stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You're suggesting we get married, to protect Rosie." "To protect both of you," Grant corrected, "and to make Vernon Rusk's life a whole lot more complicated." That's... That's insane. Probably, Grant agreed. But it might also work. Vernon's playing by the rules of law and society. Twisted rules, but still rules. We can use those same rules against him. A legally married couple is a lot harder to separate than a desperate widow and her child. Lydia swayed on her feet, and Grant quickly moved to support her, guiding her to the sofa where Rosie still slept peacefully. Lydia sank down beside her daughter, one hand automatically reaching out to stroke the girl's hair. "You barely know us," she whispered. "Why would you tie yourself to us like that? Marriage it's permanent, legal. You'd be taking on all our problems, all our debts, all our dangers." "I know. Vernon could come after you legally. He could make your life hell. He's already going to do that. You'd be stuck with a sick woman and her traumatized child." "Could be worse," Grant said. "Could be stuck out here alone with nothing but my own thoughts for company. At least you two are interesting." Despite everything, Lydia almost smiled. Almost. "This is madness." "Most of the worthwhile things in life are," Grant said. He crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to eye level. "Listen to me, Lydia. I know this isn't what either of us planned. I know we're strangers, but sometimes strangers become allies, and sometimes allies become family. Your daughter already thinks I'm some kind of angel, which is hilarious if you knew half the things I've done. But maybe this is my chance to actually be the man she thinks I am." "I can't ask you to do this," Lydia said, but her voice was weakening, her protests losing conviction. "You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." Grant paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I'm not asking for a real marriage, if that's what worries you. This would be a legal arrangement. Protection for you and Rosie. Nothing more. You'd have your own room, your own life. I'm just a name on a paper and a man with a rifle who's willing to stand between you and Vernon Rusk. That's all." Lydia looked down at Rosie, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the adult conversation happening above her. When she looked back at Grant, her eyes were clear and determined despite the tears streaming down her face. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we actually do this insane thing, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that if Vernon somehow wins, if he finds a way to take her despite everything, you'll get Rosie away. You'll take her somewhere safe, somewhere he can never find her, even if it means breaking the law, even if it means losing everything. Promise me you'll save her." Grant looked into those desperate eyes and saw himself 10 years ago, making a different promise to a different dying woman. He'd failed then, but maybe he didn't have to fail now. "I promise," he said. "On my life and my soul, I promise." Lydia nodded slowly, then held out her hand. "Then yes. Yes, I'll marry you, Grant Holloway. God help us both." Grant took her hand, feeling the tremor in her fingers, the fever warmth that still lingered in her skin. This woman who'd run into the desert to save her daughter. This woman who'd nearly died rather than submit to tyranny. This woman who was now trusting him with everything she had left. "We'll need a preacher," he said practically, already thinking through the logistics. "And witnesses. It has to be legal enough that Vernon's lawyers can't break it." "There's a preacher in Miller's Crossing," Lydia said. "The same town where your sheriff friend is." "Sam's not exactly a friend," Grant admitted. "But he's honest. That'll have to be enough." "When?" Lydia asked, and Grant could hear the exhaustion creeping back into her voice. The conversation, the stress, the terror, it was all catching up with her again. "Tomorrow," he decided. "Tonight you rest. Get your strength back. Tomorrow morning, we ride to Miller's Crossing, we get married, and we make ourselves a family that Vernon Rusk can't tear apart no matter how hard he tries." "Tomorrow," Lydia echoed, her eyes already drifting closed. Such a small word for such a big change. "Best kind of change happens fast," Grant said. "Gives you less time to talk yourself out of it." Lydia's hand squeezed his once, then went slack as sleep claimed her again. Grant gently extracted himself and stood, looking down at the woman and child on his old sofa. His future wife and stepdaughter, if this crazy plan actually worked. He moved to the window, looking out at the setting sun painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere out there, Vernon Rusk was plotting his next move. Somewhere out there, lawyers and hired guns were preparing to descend on this little ranch. But Grant had faced worse than lawyers and bought judges. He'd faced death itself in all its forms, had learned its patterns, its tricks, its inevitable march. And he'd learned something else too. Sometimes the only way to beat death was to grab life with both hands and refuse to let go. Tomorrow, he'd marry a woman he barely knew to save a child he'd met yesterday. It was insane. It was desperate. It was probably doomed to fail. But Grant Holloway had been doomed before, and he was still standing. He'd be damned if he'd let Vernon Rusk change that. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of morning that made promises feel possible even when logic said otherwise. Grant had been awake for hours, his mind racing through every possible complication, every way Vernon Rusk might counter their desperate gambit. He'd finally given up on sleep around 4 and busied himself preparing for the journey to Miller's Crossing, checking soldiers' shoes, packing supplies, and trying not to think too hard about what he was about to do. Marry a stranger, become a stepfather, paint a target on his back that might never wash off. Simple, really. He heard movement from inside the house and turned to see Lydia emerging onto the porch, wrapped in one of his spare blankets against the morning chill. She looked marginally better than yesterday. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and she could stand without swaying, but she was still a long way from healthy. The journey to Miller's Crossing would be hard on her. "You should be resting," Grant said, though he knew it was pointless. Women like Lydia didn't rest when their children were in danger. "I've rested enough," she replied, her voice still rough but stronger. "We need to leave soon, don't we? Before Price comes back with reinforcements?" He said 3 days, but men like that don't always keep their word when it's inconvenient. Grant studied her face in the pale dawn light. "Are you sure about this? Once we do it, there's no taking it back. You'll be Mrs. Grant Holloway, for better or worse." "Seems appropriate," Lydia said with a ghost of a smile. "Given that we've already had plenty of worse, maybe we're due for some better." "Maybe." Grant wanted to believe that, wanted to believe that something good could come from all this desperation and fear, but he'd learned long ago that the universe didn't operate on fairness or balance. Sometimes worse just led to more worse until you drowned in it. But he didn't say that. Instead, he said, "Rosie still sleeping?" "Like the dead." Lydia's expression flickered with pain at her own words. "Poor thing. She's been so brave for so long. She deserves to sleep, to feel safe." "She will be safe," Grant said. "I'll make sure of it." Lydia looked at him for a long moment, and Grant had the uncomfortable sensation of being thoroughly evaluated. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said simply. "God help me. I actually believe you." They woke Rosie gently, fed her a quick breakfast of eggs and bread, and prepared for the journey. Grant had already saddled Soldier and hitched his old wagon. Lydia wasn't strong enough for a long ride, and the wagon would be more comfortable even if it was slower. He loaded blankets into the bed, creating a nest where Lydia could rest if needed, while Rosie bounced around asking 1,000 questions about where they were going and why. "We're going to town," Grant told her, deciding simple was best. "Your mama and I have some business to take care of." "What kind of business?" "Adult business," Lydia said, climbing carefully into the wagon with Grant's help. "The boring kind." "Oh." Rosie looked disappointed, but climbed up beside her mother without further argument. Grant swung into the driver's seat and clicked his tongue at Soldier, who leaned into the traces with the steady patience of a horse who'd done this 1,000 times. The road to Miller's Crossing was rough, little more than a pair of wheel ruts cutting through the scrubland. They passed no one in the first hour, which was both a blessing and a worry. Empty roads meant no witnesses if trouble found them, but it also meant no complications. Grant kept his rifle within easy reach and his eyes on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. Rosie chattered for the first hour, her natural resilience reasserting itself now that her immediate terror had passed. She asked Grant about everything: the birds they saw, the plants, the rock formations, how old Soldier was, whether he had any other animals, what his favorite food was, if he'd ever seen a bear. Grant answered each question with surprising patience, discovering that he actually enjoyed the girl's curiosity. It reminded him of Eleanor, who'd been similarly inquisitive before the war had stolen her childhood. Eventually, Rosie's questions tapered off and she curled up against her mother, dozing in the warm morning sun. Lydia sat quiet, one arm around her daughter, staring out at the passing landscape with distant eyes. "You're thinking about running," Grant said after a long silence. Lydia's gaze snapped to him, startled. How did you... It's written all over your face. You're calculating distances, thinking about how far we could get before they catch up, wondering if maybe Mexico would be far enough. Am I that transparent? Only to someone who's considered the same thing. Grant kept his eyes on the road. I thought about running after Eleanor died. Thought about just saddling up and riding until I hit an ocean, starting over somewhere nobody knew me or what I'd failed to do. Why didn't you? Because running doesn't change what's inside you. The guilt, the fear, the nightmares. Those things pack up and come along no matter how far you go. He glanced at her. You've already learned that, haven't you? That's why you're here instead of California or Oregon or anywhere else you could have fled to. Lydia's throat worked as she swallowed hard. We made it 300 miles. 300 miles of hiding and running and looking over our shoulders. And Vernon still found us. His men were always one step behind, always getting closer. I kept thinking if we could just get far enough, if we could just disappear into the frontier, we'd be safe. But there is no far enough, is there? Not from a man with money and determination. Not by running, no, Grant agreed. But there's other ways to be safe. Legal ways. Ways that don't involve dying of thirst in the desert. You really think a marriage certificate will stop him? I think it'll slow him down, make him think twice, and maybe give us time to find other ammunition. Grant paused, then added, You said your husband died last year. How much of his estate did you inherit? Lydia's laugh was bitter. Technically, all of it. James left everything to me in his will. The ranch, the cattle operation, the accounts, everything. It was worth considerable money. Still is, I suppose, though Vernon's been managing it since James died. Managing it, Grant repeated. Not owning it. No, it's in my name. James made sure of that. He didn't trust his family much, said they were vultures who'd pick the bones of anything valuable. She paused. He wasn't wrong. So let me get this straight. You're a wealthy woman running from a man who wants to marry you to get control of that wealth. And instead, you're about to marry a broke rancher who can barely keep his own operation afloat. When you put it that way, it sounds even more insane than I thought, Lydia said. But there was a hint of humor in her voice now, dark as it was. Vernon's going to lose his mind, Grant said with satisfaction. All that money, all that power, slipping through his fingers because you married some nobody he's never heard of. He'll fight it. He'll claim I was coerced, that I wasn't in my right mind, that you took advantage of a sick woman. Let him claim whatever he wants. A legal marriage is a legal marriage. And if we do this right, proper preacher, proper witnesses, everything documented, his lawyers will have a hell of a time breaking it. Grant paused. Of course, that assumes the preacher in Miller's Crossing is willing to marry us. Is he? Reverend Samuel Walsh. Good man, mostly. War veteran like me, lost his left arm at Gettysburg. He's not much for society's rules when he thinks they're wrong. Grant considered. He might do it, especially if we tell him the truth about why we're asking. And the sheriff, your friend who's not quite a friend? Sam Fletcher's a harder sell. He's honest, which is good for us, but he's also a stickler for proper procedure. If Vernon's lawyers show up with documents that look legitimate, Sam's going to want to follow the letter of the law. Grant's jaw tightened. We'll have to convince him there's more to this than a simple custody dispute. There is more to this, Lydia said softly. Vernon didn't just want to marry me for the estate. He wanted... She trailed off, glancing down at Rosie to make sure the girl was truly asleep. He wanted to erase James, replace him. He said it should have been him all along, that James stole what should have been his. The estate. The respect. Me. He was obsessed with the idea that I was somehow rightfully his, that fate or God or whatever had made a mistake when James courted me instead of him. Grant felt his hands tighten on the reins. He told you this? At the funeral. Everyone else had left and he cornered me in the parlor, told me that now that James was gone, things could be set right, that we could be married within the year, and it would be as if... Her voice cracked. As if James had never existed. As if Rosie wasn't James's daughter but would become Vernon's. He had it all planned out. How we'd live, how he'd manage the estate, how Rosie would be raised properly without her father's weak influence. Jesus, Grant muttered. I told him no, of course. Told him I was in mourning and had no intention of ever remarrying. That's when he got angry, said I was being foolish, that a woman couldn't run an estate alone, that I needed a man's guidance. When I still refused, Lydia's free hand drifted to her wrist, and Grant noticed for the first time the faint bruise there, yellowed with age but still visible. He made it clear that my cooperation was expected, not requested, that if I continued to be difficult, there were other ways to achieve the same result. He threatened to take Rosie. Not just threatened, he had papers drawn up declaring me mentally unstable within a week of that conversation, had his personal physician examine me without my permission, based entirely on Vernon's word, and produce a diagnosis of hysteria and delusional thinking. By the time I realized what was happening, he already had a judge's signature on a custody order. I had hours to flee before his men came to collect Rosie. Grant processed this, his mind cataloging the calculated cruelty of it. Vernon Rusk wasn't just a greedy relative. He was a predator who'd been methodically dismantling Lydia's life, piece by piece, closing off every legitimate avenue of resistance, until running into the desert had seemed like the only option left. How long ago was that, when you ran? 5 weeks. We took a train east initially, then doubled back west on a different line. Traveled by stagecoach, by wagon, on foot. Spent every dollar I'd managed to hide from Vernon. Kept moving, kept hoping we'd get far enough away. She looked down at Rosie. We almost didn't make it. If you hadn't found us. But I did, Grant said firmly. And now we're going to make it legal that Vernon Rusk has no claim on either of you. Not legal, not moral, not any other kind. They crested a small rise, and Miller's Crossing came into view, a scattered collection of buildings that optimistically called itself a town. There was a main street with perhaps a dozen structures, including a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and at the far end a small whitewashed church with a crooked steeple. The sheriff's office sat right in the center of town, its single jail cell visible through the barred window. Not exactly impressive, Lydia murmured. It's civilization, Grant replied. Out here, that counts for something. He guided Soldier down the main street, acutely aware of the curious stares from the few townsfolk already up and about. A stranger was always noteworthy in a place this small, but a stranger with a woman and child in his wagon was downright scandalous. Grant could practically hear the gossip starting already. He pulled up in front of the church and set the brake. Wait here. I'll see if the Reverend's available. Grant found Samuel Walsh in the small room behind the church that served as both his office and living quarters, bent over a Bible with reading spectacles perched on his nose. The Reverend looked up at Grant's knock, and his weathered face split into a surprised smile. Grant Holloway. Haven't seen you in town in months. What brings you down from that hermitage of yours? Need a favor, Sam, Grant said without preamble. A big one. The Reverend's smile faded as he took in Grant's expression. What kind of favor? The marrying kind. Walsh blinked. You're getting married? To whom? I didn't even know you were courting anyone. I'm not. Wasn't. It's complicated. Grant removed his hat, turning it in his hands. There's a woman outside with her daughter. Her name's Lydia Marsh. She's a widow running from her dead husband's brother who wants to take her child. I found them dying in the desert 2 days ago. Now I need to marry her to protect them both. Reverend Walsh stared at him for a long moment. Grant, I've known you for 7 years. In all that time, I've never seen you so much as look at a woman twice. Now you want me to believe you found one in the desert and need to marry her immediately? I don't need you to believe anything except that she and her daughter are in danger, and a legal marriage will help protect them. The rest can wait for later explanations. The law is being twisted by a man with money and no morals, Grant interrupted. He's got bought physicians declaring her insane and crooked judges granting him custody. Everything's legal and everything's wrong. I'm trying to fight legal with legal. Will you help me or not? Walsh stood slowly, his empty left sleeve hanging at his side, a permanent reminder of the war they'd both survived. He studied Grant's face with the intensity of a man who'd spent years reading souls. This woman, he said carefully, she knows you're doing this to protect her? This isn't some misguided rescue that she hasn't agreed to? She knows. She's agreed. We both know what we're doing. And you understand that marriage is a sacred covenant, not a legal convenience. I understand that sometimes sacred and convenient can be the same thing, Grant said. I understand that a little girl is terrified her mother's going to be taken from her. I understand that I have the power to prevent that, and I'm choosing to use it. If that offends your religious sensibilities, I'm sorry, but I'm doing it anyway. I just hoped you'd be the one to do it right. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, removed his spectacles, and rubbed his eyes. You always were stubborn. Even in the war, you'd argue with God himself if you thought he was wrong. He looked up. But you were also the man who carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire when everyone else had given up on them. So yes, Grant, I'll marry you to this woman. But I'm doing it because I trust that you believe you're doing the right thing, not because I fully understand what's happening. Relief flooded through Grant. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If this goes badly, we'll both have some explaining to do. Walsh grabbed his coat and his worn Bible. Let's meet this bride of yours. They found Lydia awake and looking nervous, with Rosie pressed against her side. Grant helped them both down from the wagon, noting how Lydia's legs trembled slightly. She was pushing herself too hard, but there was no help for it now. Reverend Walsh's expression softened immediately when he saw them. Whatever he'd been expecting, the reality of a sick woman and frightened child clearly affected him. Mrs. Marsh, he said gently, I'm Reverend Samuel Walsh. Grant's told me something of your situation. Before we proceed, I need to hear from you that this marriage is your choice, made of your own free will and sound mind. Lydia straightened despite her obvious exhaustion. It is my choice, Reverend. I'm marrying Mr. Holloway to protect my daughter from a man who would use the law to kidnap her. I know it's unconventional. I know it's sudden. But I'm sound of mind and clear of purpose. This is what I want to do. Walsh nodded slowly. And you understand that marriage is not easily undone? That this will be a legal and binding contract? I understand, Lydia said, and I accept those terms. What about you, Grant? You understand you're taking on responsibility for both wife and child? That this isn't something you can walk away from when it becomes inconvenient? I understand, Grant said, and I'm not planning on walking away. Then I suppose we have a wedding to perform. Walsh looked around the empty street. Though we'll need witnesses, 2, minimum, for the marriage to be legal. I'll get them, Grant said. He strode to the sheriff's office, pushed open the door, and found Sam Fletcher nursing a cup of coffee at his desk. The sheriff looked up in surprise. Grant, what are you doing in town? Getting married. Need you as a witness. Fletcher's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. You're what? Getting married. To a woman I found in the desert. Her dead husband's brother is trying to steal her kid. The wedding's in 5 minutes. You coming or not? Fletcher stared at him. You've lost your mind. Probably. You coming? The sheriff set down his coffee cup with exaggerated care. You know I have to ask. Is this woman being coerced? She's being protected. There's a difference. You want to ask her yourself, that's fine. But we're doing this either way, and I'd rather have witnesses who'll testify to the wedding's legitimacy if it comes to that. Fletcher studied him for a long moment, then stood and grabbed his hat. This better not come back to bite me in the ass, Holloway. If it does, I'll take the teeth marks myself. They collected Mrs. Chen from the general store, a practical woman who'd witnessed half the weddings and most of the deaths in Miller's Crossing and never asked questions she didn't need answers to, and gathered in front of the small church. It wasn't romantic. There were no flowers, no decorations, no guests beyond the bare minimum required by law. But as Reverend Walsh opened his Bible and began to speak, something shifted in the morning air. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God, and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Rosie stood between her mother and Grant, holding both their hands, her small face serious and intent. She'd figured out what was happening, children always did, and seemed determined to be part of it. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Walsh's voice carried across the quiet street, drawing curious onlookers who kept a respectful distance but watched with fascination. Grant Holloway, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Grant looked at Lydia, really looked at her, saw the fear and hope warring in her eyes, saw the desperate love she had for her daughter, saw the strength it had taken to run into the desert rather than surrender, saw a woman worth fighting for. "I do," he said clearly. "Lydia Marsh, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Lydia's voice was steady when she answered, "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man tear asunder." Walsh closed his Bible. "You may kiss your bride." Grant hadn't thought about this part. He saw the same realization dawn in Lydia's eyes. They were married now, legally, officially, but still strangers who'd agreed to a partnership, not a romance. The kiss was expected, traditional, part of the ceremony that would make this feel real to witnesses. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. She didn't. Their lips met briefly, chastely, a promise sealed but not yet understood. When they pulled apart, Rosie was grinning up at them. "Does this mean Grant's my papa now?" she asked. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "If you want him to be, sweetheart." "I want him to be," Rosie declared, then threw her arms around Grant's waist with the unselfconscious affection of a child who'd decided someone was safe. "You're my papa now. My other papa's in heaven, but you're my earth papa." Grant's throat closed up. He looked down at the small girl clinging to him, felt her absolute trust, her desperate need for security and protection. His hand came up almost of its own accord, settling on her tangled blonde hair. "Yeah," he managed. "Yeah, I guess I am." Sheriff Fletcher cleared his throat. "Well, congratulations, I suppose. You'll need to register this at the courthouse in Tucson for it to be fully legal territory-wide." "We'll do that," Grant said. "Soon as we can." "Better be very soon," Fletcher said, his expression serious. "There's been talk. Lawyers from Phoenix asking questions about a missing woman and child, money changing hands. If this is about what I think it's about, you've stepped into something bigger than you realize, Grant." "I know exactly what I've stepped into," Grant replied. "That's why we did this." Fletcher shook his head. "Your funeral. Just remember I warned you." But he signed the marriage certificate as witness, as did Mrs. Chen and Reverend Walsh filled in the official documentation with careful penmanship. "There," Walsh said, handing the paper to Grant. "You're legally married in the eyes of God, the territory, and anyone else who matters. May God bless your union and protect your family." Family. The word echoed strangely in Grant's mind. He'd been alone for so long that the concept felt foreign, like a language he'd once spoken but had forgotten. Yet here he stood with a wife and a daughter, not by any traditional path, but his nonetheless. They were walking back to the wagon when the sound of approaching horses made Grant's hand instinct reach for his rifle. A group of riders appeared at the far end of the street, moving fast and purposeful. Grant counted 6 men, all well armed, led by Edmund Price, the lawyer from yesterday. "Get in the wagon," Grant said quietly to Lydia. "Now." She didn't argue, gathering Rosie and climbing up with Grant's help. He positioned himself between them and the approaching riders, rifle held casually but ready. Sheriff Fletcher, to his credit, stayed at Grant's side, his hand resting on his own sidearm. Price reined in his horse hard enough to make it dance sideways, dust billowing up around them. His face was flushed with anger and something that looked like triumph. "There she is," he called out, pointing at Lydia. "There's the woman we've been tracking. Mrs. Marsh, you're coming with us. We have legal documentation from the Phoenix courthouse granting custody of your daughter to Vernon Rusk. Interfering with that custody is a criminal act." "Actually," Grant said calmly, "she's not Mrs. Marsh anymore. She's Mrs. Holloway. As of about 10 minutes ago." Price's face went through several interesting shades of red before settling on purple. "You... what?" "We got married," Grant said. "Legal and witnessed. Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony. Sheriff Fletcher here signed as witness, along with Mrs. Chen from the general store. Everything proper and above board." "That's impossible. You can't marry someone to circumvent a legal custody order." Sure I can, Grant said. Marriage is legal. I'm a legal resident of this territory. She's a legal resident. We're both of sound mind and legal age. There's no law saying we can't get married for protective reasons. This is a sham, a fraud designed to Careful, Sheriff Fletcher interrupted. You're about to accuse a man I've known for years of criminal fraud. You want to make that accusation officially? You better have evidence beyond your employer's hurt feelings. Price wheeled on Fletcher. You witnessed this farce? You're supposed to uphold the law. I did uphold the law, Fletcher said. I witnessed a legal marriage between two consenting adults. That's not a crime, Mr. Price. Now, you want to pursue this custody matter, you're welcome to take it up with the courts. But right now, you're on my town's main street making threats at people who haven't broken any laws. I suggest you move along before I decide you're disturbing the peace. For a moment, Grant thought Price might actually try something stupid. The lawyer's hand twitched toward his coat, and the men behind him shifted in their saddles. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. Then Price seemed to collect himself. This isn't over, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Vernon Rusk doesn't lose. You've just delayed the inevitable, Holloway. And you, he pointed at Fletcher, you've chosen the wrong side. You'll regret it. I've regretted bigger things than witnessing a wedding, Fletcher said. Now get out of my town before I find a reason to lock you up for the night. We've got vagrancy laws, you know. Price yanked his horse around and spurred it back down the street, his men following in a cloud of angry dust. Grant watched them go, his heart pounding but his hand steady on the rifle. That could have gone worse, Fletcher observed. Could have gone better too, Grant replied. He's going back to Vernon Rusk with the news. They'll regroup, come back with more lawyers, more legal documents, more threats. Probably, Fletcher agreed. But for now, you bought yourself some time. What you do with it is your business. He tipped his hat to Lydia. Ma'am, congratulations on your marriage. I hope it brings you the peace you're looking for. Thank you, Sheriff, Lydia said softly. For everything. Fletcher nodded and walked back toward his office, leaving Grant alone with his new family. He climbed into the wagon, aware of Lydia's eyes on him, of Rosie pressed close to her mother's side. That man, Lydia said quietly. He's going to tell Vernon. Yes, Vernon's going to be furious. Yes, this might have made things worse instead of better. Grant gathered the reins and clicked to Soldier. Maybe, but at least now when he comes for you, he'll have to acknowledge you're my wife and Rosie's my stepdaughter. That makes you harder to take. That makes this fight legally complicated enough that his bought judges might actually have to follow real law instead of just his wishes. Or it might just make him more determined, Lydia said. Then he'll find out exactly how determined I can be in return, Grant said. Because, Mrs. Holloway, you and your daughter are family now. And I don't let anyone hurt my family. Rosie reached across her mother and took Grant's hand. Earth, Papa, she said firmly, as if settling something important. Grant squeezed her small fingers gently. Earth, Papa, he agreed. They rode out of Miller's Crossing with the morning sun climbing toward noon, a newly formed family bound by desperation and determination in equal measure. Behind them, Grant could feel the weight of watching eyes, the speculation and gossip already spreading. Ahead lay his ranch, his land, and whatever fight Vernon Rusk brought to his doorstep. But for the first time in 10 years, Grant Holloway felt like he had something worth fighting for. A reason to face down whatever came next. A family that needed him as much as he needed them, though neither side had fully admitted it yet. Grant? Lydia's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Yeah? Thank you for this, for everything. I know it's not what you signed up for when you rode out yesterday morning. Grant thought about that. About the man he'd been yesterday, alone, haunted, slowly calcifying into isolation. About the man he was now, married, a stepfather, deliberately walking into a fight that could destroy him. Maybe it's exactly what I signed up for, he said quietly. I just didn't know it yet. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but somehow less lonely than it had been. 3 hearts where there had been one. 3 lives bound together by ceremony and necessity, and something else, something that felt almost like hope. Grant clicked his tongue at Soldier, and they headed home. They made it halfway home before the sky turned wrong. Grant noticed it first, the way the western horizon had gone from clear blue to an ominous yellow-gray, like a bruise spreading across the heavens. The wind shifted too, no longer the steady desert breeze, but something fitful and aggressive, gusting hard enough to rock the wagon and send tumbleweeds careening across the trail like drunken dancers. "Storm coming," he said, more to himself than to Lydia, but she heard anyway and looked up sharply. "How bad?" "Bad enough." Grant scanned the landscape, calculating distances and shelter options. They were too far from Miller's Crossing to turn back, still an hour from the ranch, and that sky was darkening fast, the kind of speed that meant serious weather. Could be just wind and dust. Could be worse. Could be worse how? Lydia's arms tightened around Rosie, who'd been dozing against her mother's shoulder. Sandstorm. The kind that strips paint off buildings and flesh off bones if you're caught in the open. Grant urged Soldier to move faster, but the gelding was already nervous, ears swiveling back and forth, nostrils flaring. Animals knew when bad weather was coming. They could feel it in ways humans couldn't. The wind picked up again, harder this time, carrying the first stinging particles of sand. Rosie woke with a startled cry, and Grant saw fear bloom in Lydia's eyes, the kind of fear that came from already barely surviving the desert once. "There's an old way station about 20 minutes ahead," Grant said, raising his voice over the growing wind. "Used to be a stagecoach stop before the route changed. It's mostly ruins, but it's got walls and a roof. We can wait out the storm there." 20 minutes, Lydia repeated, looking at that advancing wall of darkness. "Will we make it?" "We'll make it," Grant said with more confidence than he felt. He snapped the reins, pushing Soldier harder. The wagon bounced over ruts and rocks, making Lydia grab the seat to keep from being thrown. Rosie buried her face against her mother's chest, whimpering. The storm hit like a living thing, a roaring wall of wind and sand that turned day into twilight in seconds. Grant could barely see 10 feet ahead, the world reduced to a brown chaos of howling air and stinging particles. He wrapped his bandana around his face and kept driving by instinct and prayer, trusting Soldier to follow the trail, even when Grant couldn't see it. "Cover your faces," he shouted back to Lydia. "Don't breathe deep." He could barely hear her response over the wind's shriek, but saw her pull her shawl over both her and Rosie's heads, creating a small shelter against the assault of sand. The wagon lurched sickeningly as it hit a deep rut, and for a heart-stopping moment Grant thought they'd overturn. But Soldier kept his feet, kept moving forward, and the wagon righted itself. The way station materialized out of the brown fog like a ghost, adobe walls still standing despite years of abandonment, most of the roof intact. Grant aimed for it, barely making out the dark rectangle of the doorway. He pulled Soldier to a stop as close to the entrance as possible and jumped down, immediately staggered by the wind's force. "Stay there!" he yelled up to Lydia, then fought his way to Soldier's head. The horse was wild-eyed with terror, but trusted Grant enough to let himself be led. Grant pulled him toward the side of the building where an old lean-to offered minimal shelter, tied him quickly with shaking fingers, then ran back to the wagon. Lydia was trying to climb down with Rosie in her arms, her movements slow and clumsy with exhaustion and the wind buffeting her. Grant grabbed them both, essentially lifting them off the wagon and half carrying, half dragging them toward the doorway. Sand filled his eyes, his mouth, his lungs. Each breath was a labor, each step a battle. They tumbled through the doorway into sudden relative quiet. The wind still screamed outside, sand hissing against the walls, but the thick adobe muffled the worst of it. Grant slammed the old wooden door shut behind them, amazed it was still on its hinges, and leaned against it, coughing violently. "Is everyone all right?" he managed between coughs. "I think so," Lydia gasped. She was on the floor where they'd fallen, Rosie clutched against her chest, both of them covered in a fine layer of gritty dust. "Oh God, I thought, when that wind hit, we made it," Grant said. "That's what matters." Rosie started crying, the scared, hiccuping sobs of a child who'd held her fear in as long as she could. Lydia held her tight, rocking her, murmuring comfort that was almost lost in the storm's roar. Grant looked around their shelter, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through gaps in the roof and walls. The way station had seen better days. The floor was dirt-packed hard by years of use and abandonment. One wall had partially collapsed, and debris littered the corners. But it was shelter. It would keep them alive through the storm. He moved to check the walls, testing their stability, looking for any sections that might collapse. The old stagecoach station had been built to last, solid adobe construction that had weathered decades of desert punishment. It would hold, probably. "How long will this last?" Lydia asked. She'd gotten control of her own breathing, but looked utterly exhausted, dark circles under her eyes made more prominent by the dust coating her face. "Sandstorms can blow for hours, sometimes days." Grant saw her face go pale and added quickly, "But this one doesn't feel like a multi-day storm. Few hours, maybe. We'll be all right." "Few hours," Lydia repeated numbly. She looked down at Rosie, who'd stopped crying but was clinging to her mother with desperate strength. "We have water?" Grant checked the canteen at his belt. "Still there, thank God." "Enough. And there's supplies in the wagon if we need them. Once the wind dies down a bit, I'll make a run for it." "Don't," Lydia said sharply. "Don't risk it for supplies. We can manage with what we have." "Lydia, please." Her eyes met his, and Grant saw something raw there. "I've already watched you risk your life for us multiple times. I can't. We can't lose you. Not now." The words hung in the dusty air between them, weighted with more meaning than either was ready to examine. Grant nodded slowly. "All right. We'll wait." He settled himself against the wall near them, close enough to offer protection, but far enough to maintain the careful boundaries they'd established. They were married now, but marriage of convenience or not, they were still strangers learning to navigate each other's presence. The storm raged outside, and they waited in the semi-darkness, listening to the wind's fury and the sand's assault. Rosie eventually fell into an exhausted sleep in her mother's arms, her small face peaceful despite the chaos around them. Lydia stroked her daughter's hair with infinite tenderness, and Grant watched them both, these two lives he'd somehow become responsible for. "I was trained as a nurse," Lydia said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "Before I married James. Did Rosie tell you that?" "She mentioned it. I was good at it too. Really good. The head nurse said I had a gift for diagnosis, for seeing patterns and symptoms that others missed." Lydia smiled sadly. "But James's mother said it wasn't appropriate for a Rusk wife to work, that my place was in the home, managing servants and hosting dinners and producing heirs. So I stopped. Gave up something I loved because that's what you did when you married into that family. You gave things up." "James," Grant said carefully. "What was he like?" "Kind," Lydia said immediately. "Genuinely kind. He saw how his family suffocated me, and he tried to give me freedom where he could. He bought me medical texts so I could keep learning. He'd ask my opinion on illnesses and the workers on the ranch, let me help even though his mother disapproved. He wasn't perfect. He was weak sometimes, too willing to bend to his family's will to keep peace. But he loved me, and he loved Rosie more than anything in the world." "How did he really die?" Grant asked. The truth this time. Lydia was quiet for so long Grant thought she might not answer. When she did speak, her voice was barely audible over the storm. "He was thrown from a horse, that much is true, but the horse was spooked. Someone shot near it deliberately, made it rear. I was there. I saw the rider in the distance, saw the flash of the rifle. James hit his head on a rock and never woke up." She paused. "Vernon was the first one to reach us. He seemed so concerned, so grieved, but his eyes weren't sad. They were calculating. And later, when I mentioned the shot to the sheriff, Vernon said I must have been mistaken, that my grief was making me imagine things, that no one else had heard anything." Grant's jaw tightened. "You think Vernon killed his own brother?" "I think Vernon saw an opportunity and took it. James was going to change his will. He'd told me the night before. He wanted to set up trusts that would protect Rosie and me from family interference, that would ensure the estate stayed in our control no matter what. He had an appointment with his lawyer that afternoon, but he never made it to that appointment." "Christ," Grant muttered. "I have no proof," Lydia continued. "Just a wife's intuition and a glimpse of a distant rider. Not enough to convince a sheriff, especially not when Vernon controls half the county through money and influence. So I said nothing, buried my husband, mourned him properly. And when Vernon started pushing marriage, started showing his true intentions, I still tried to do the right thing through legal channels. I contacted lawyers. I filed complaints. I tried to protect Rosie through the law. Her laugh was bitter. But Vernon owns the law in that county, owns the judges, the sheriff, even some of the lawyers I tried to hire. Every door I knocked on was already closed, so I ran. It was all I had left. Grant absorbed this, understanding now the full scope of what they were up against. This wasn't just a greedy relative wanting money. This was a man who'd possibly committed murder, who'd systematically destroyed every legitimate avenue of resistance, who had the resources and connections to make people disappear if they became inconvenient. And Grant had just made himself extremely inconvenient by marrying Lydia and claiming Rosie as his stepdaughter. "I should have told you all this before," Lydia said, "before you married me. You deserve to know what you were walking into." "Would it have changed anything?" Grant asked. "No," she admitted, "but it would have been fair to you." "Fairness is overrated," Grant said. "Doing the right thing matters more." A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the building, making the walls shudder. Dust sifted down from the ceiling, and through a gap in the roof, Grant could see the brown chaos of the storm still raging. They'd be here for a while yet. Lydia shifted Rosie's weight, trying to get more comfortable on the hard-packed dirt floor. Grant saw her wince, saw the exhaustion in every line of her body. She was still recovering, still sick, and now they were trapped in an abandoned way station in the middle of a sandstorm with God knew what coming after them once the weather cleared. "Here," Grant said, shrugging out of his coat despite the chill. "Use this as a pillow. You need to rest while you can." "I'm fine," Lydia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're not fine. You're barely recovered from nearly dying 3 days ago. You got married this morning, and you've been bounced around in a wagon for hours. Rest. I'll keep watch." "Watch for what? We're in a storm." "Old habits," Grant said. "War taught me that trouble doesn't wait for convenient timing." Lydia looked like she wanted to argue more, but exhaustion won. She accepted the coat, folded it into a makeshift pillow, and carefully laid Rosie down on it before settling beside her daughter. Within minutes, both mother and daughter were asleep, Rosie's small hand curled in her mother's larger one. Grant kept his vigil, watching the storm, watching his unlikely family, and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Price would report back to Vernon. Vernon would regroup, come at them with new strategies, new legal attacks. The marriage would slow him down, but not stop him. A man who'd killed his own brother wouldn't balk at other forms of violence if pushed. The question was how far Vernon would go. Would he respect the boundaries of law, twisted as his interpretation might be? Or would he abandon all pretense and simply take what he wanted by force? Grant's hand rested on his rifle. He'd faced worse odds in the war. Outnumbered, outgunned, operating with inadequate supplies and no reinforcements. He'd survived through stubbornness, cunning, and a refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. He could survive this too. They could survive this. The storm began to ease as the afternoon wore on, the wind's fury gradually diminishing to mere violence rather than apocalyptic rage. Grant waited until the sand had stopped pelting the walls before carefully opening the door and peering outside. The world had been transformed. Everything was buried under a thick layer of sand. The wagon, soldiers' lean-to, the trail itself. The air was still hazy with suspended dust, turning the sun into a dim orange disk. But the worst had passed. Grant checked on Soldier first. The gelding was covered in sand but otherwise unharmed, though clearly rattled by the experience. Grant spoke soothingly to him while checking for injuries, then made his way to the wagon. The supplies he'd loaded that morning were still there, though buried under several inches of sand. He dug out blankets, food, and his medical kit, carrying them back to the way station in multiple trips. Lydia woke as he was making his third trip, sitting up carefully to avoid disturbing Rosie. "Did the storm pass?" "Mostly. We should stay here tonight, though. Too risky to travel in this visibility, and both you and Rosie need proper rest." "We're imposing on your hospitality even more than we already have," Lydia said, attempting a smile that didn't quite work. "You're my wife," Grant said, then felt his face heat slightly at his own words. "What I mean is you're not imposing. This is just practical survival." "Your wife," Lydia repeated softly. "That's going to take some getting used to." Grant busied himself with spreading out blankets, creating a more comfortable sleeping area than the bare dirt floor. For both of us, he agreed. They settled in for the evening, Grant coaxing a small fire to life in what had once been the way station's fireplace, still functional despite decades of neglect. He heated water for tea mixed with willow bark powder to help Lydia's lingering fever. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Rosie waking long enough to eat before falling asleep again, exhausted by the day's terrors. As darkness fell and the fire crackled, Grant and Lydia sat in companionable silence. Outside, the desert night settled in with its usual sounds, coyotes calling, the wind whispering through gaps in the walls, the subtle creaks and groans of the old building. "Tell me about your sister," Lydia said suddenly. "Eleanor, Rosie mentioned you talked about someone who died." Grant's first instinct was to deflect, to change the subject. He'd spent 10 years not talking about Eleanor, but something about the day they'd survived, the family they'd become, loosened his tongue. "She was 14, he said quietly, bright as hell, curious about everything. She was helping in the field hospital during the war, too young to be there, but we needed every pair of hands. She cut herself on a dirty blade while cleaning instruments. Small cut, nothing that should have killed her, but infection set in, gangrene. I tried everything, amputation, every treatment I knew. Nothing worked. She died 3 days after that cut, in agony, calling for our mother who'd died years before." "You couldn't have saved her," Lydia said gently. "I was her big brother. Saving her was my job." Grant's voice was rough. "I'd saved dozens of soldiers with worse injuries, but when it mattered most, when it was someone I actually loved, I failed. After that, I stopped trying to save anyone. Came out here to be alone. Figured if I wasn't around people, I couldn't fail them." "And then you found us," Lydia said. "And then I found you," Grant agreed. "2 more people I'm probably going to fail." "Or," Lydia said firmly, 2 people you're going to save have saved already. Grant, you pulled me back from death. You gave us shelter, protection, your name. You stood up to Vernon's lawyers with nothing but determination and a rifle. That's not failure, that's heroism. Heroes don't run away to live alone in the desert for 10 years. Heroes do what they must to survive their own traumas," Lydia countered, "and when they're needed again, they answer the call. That's what you did. That's what you're doing." Grant looked at her across the fire, this woman who'd run into the desert to save her child, who'd agreed to marry a stranger to protect her daughter, who'd survived fever and exhaustion and a murderous brother-in-law's machinations. She knew something about surviving trauma herself. "We're quite a pair," he said. 2 broken people trying to protect 1 innocent child." "Maybe broken people are the best protectors," Lydia said. "We know what's worth fighting for because we've lost so much already." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Rosie slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling steadily. Outside, the desert night deepened, full of dangers both known and unknown. "Tomorrow," Grant said, "we head home. We fortify the ranch as best we can. We prepare for whatever Vernon sends next. Legal challenges, hired men, whatever. And we hold the line. Together." "Together," Lydia echoed. She held out her hand across the fire, and Grant took it. Not romantic, not passionate, but something else. A partnership forged in desperation and sealed in determination. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the flames, 2 warriors acknowledging each other before battle. Then Lydia withdrew her hand and settled back against the wall, her eyes already drooping with exhaustion. "Thank you, Grant," she murmured, "for everything. For being the man who stopped when he heard a child crying. For being the man who stood between us and those lawyers. For being—" She trailed off, sleep claiming her before she could finish. Grant watched her for a moment, then banked the fire and settled himself near the doorway, rifle across his lap. He wouldn't sleep much tonight. Old instincts and new responsibilities wouldn't allow it. But that was all right. He'd gone without sleep before, and now he had a reason beyond mere survival to stay alert. He had a family to protect, no matter how unconventional that family might be. The night wore on. Grant kept his vigil. And somewhere out there in the darkness, he knew Vernon Rusk was planning his next move. But so was Grant. And this time, he wouldn't fail. He wouldn't allow himself to fail. Too much depended on it. Morning came with surprising gentleness, the sun rising over a transformed landscape where the storm had rearranged the desert like a willful child rearranging toys. Grant had dozed fitfully through the night, waking at every sound, his body refusing deep sleep even when his mind desperately needed it. Lydia woke shortly after dawn, and together they prepared for the final leg of their journey home. Rosie was cranky and clingy, the previous day's traumas catching up with her in the way children's fears often did, delayed but intense. Grant let her hold his hand while they loaded the wagon, answering her worried questions with patience he didn't know he possessed. Will there be more storms? Maybe someday, but not today. Will the bad men come to our house? They might try, but I won't let them hurt you or your mama. Promise? Grant crouched down to her eye level, taking both her small hands in his. I promise, Rosie. Earth Papa promises. The words seemed to satisfy her. She climbed into the wagon next to her mother without further protest, and they set off toward the ranch through the sand-altered landscape. They arrived home near midday, and Grant felt something ease in his chest at the sight of his ranch still standing, unchanged by the storm that had caught them. But the ease was temporary. Because even as they pulled into the yard, Grant saw what he'd been half expecting, half dreading. A lone rider sat on a beautiful black horse near the fence line, waiting. Not Price this time. Someone else. Someone who sat with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. Vernon Rusk had come calling. Grant felt Lydia freeze beside him, felt the terror ripple through her body. Rosie whimpered and buried her face against her mother's side. Stay in the wagon, Grant said quietly. No matter what happens, stay in the wagon until I say otherwise. Grant! Stay. In the wagon. He climbed down, rifle in hand but not raised, and walked toward the waiting rider. As he got closer, he could see Vernon Rusk more clearly. A handsome man in his late 30s, well-dressed in city clothes that probably cost more than Grant's entire ranch, with cold blue eyes that assessed Grant like a butcher sizing up meat. Mr. Holloway, I presume, Vernon said, his voice cultured and smooth. I'm Vernon Rusk. I believe you've met my lawyer, Mr. Price, and I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have a wife and a stepdaughter, Grant replied calmly, neither of whom belong to you. Vernon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Ah, yes, the marriage. Very clever, very desperate, but ultimately meaningless. Law says otherwise. The law, Vernon said, is whatever I decide it is. Money and influence have a remarkable way of shaping legal outcomes, Mr. Holloway, something you're about to learn firsthand. That a threat? Simply a statement of fact. Now, I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to compensate you for your inconvenience, say $5,000 to annul this sham marriage and return my sister-in-law and niece to my care. That's more than generous given the circumstances. $5,000. More money than Grant had seen in years. Enough to rebuild his ranch, buy new stock, live comfortably for a decade. He didn't even hesitate. No. Vernon's expression hardened. Mr. Holloway, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. I can make your life very difficult. Legal proceedings that drain your resources, questions about your fitness as a guardian, perhaps an examination of your war record. I understand there were some incidents that reflected poorly on your judgment. Grant felt cold rage settle into his bones. Vernon had done his homework, had somehow obtained information about Grant's military service, about the decisions he'd made, the lives he'd failed to save. You can dig up whatever you want about my past, Grant said quietly, but you're not taking them. Not through legal manipulation, not through threats, not at all. That clear enough for you? Vernon studied him for a long moment, then smiled, genuinely this time, but it was the smile of a predator who'd just decided his prey would be entertaining to hunt. Crystal clear, he said. I'll see you in court, Mr. Holloway. And when I win, not if, but when, I'll make sure you lose everything. The marriage, the child, this pathetic excuse for a ranch, your freedom, possibly, depending on what charges I decide to press. You've made a powerful enemy today. Seems fair, Grant said. You made one too. Vernon laughed, a cold sound that held no humor. You think you're my enemy? You're nothing, an inconvenience, a speed bump. I've destroyed men far more significant than you for far less reason. Enjoy your brief moment of defiance, Mr. Holloway. It won't last." He turned his horse and rode away at a measured pace. No hurry, no concern, the bearing of a man who knew he held all the cards. Grant watched him go, then turned back to the wagon where Lydia sat pale as death, Rosie crying against her shoulder. "Is he gone?" Lydia whispered. "For now," Grant said. "But he'll be back. With lawyers, with court orders, with whatever weapons he thinks will break us." "Then we have no chance," Lydia said hollowly. "You saw him, heard him. He has the power to destroy us." Grant climbed back into the wagon and took Lydia's trembling hands in his. "He has money and influence. We have something better." "What?" "We have the truth. We have a legal marriage he can't break. We have a child's testimony about what she's seen. And we have stubbornness that makes his arrogance look like amateur work." Grant squeezed her hands gently. "We're not giving up, Lydia. Not now. Not ever. You hear me?" Slowly, painfully, Lydia nodded. "Not ever," she echoed. "Not ever," Rosie repeated, her small voice fierce. Grant looked at them both, his wife, his stepdaughter, his family, and felt purpose settle into him like bedrock. Let Vernon Russ come with his lawyers and his money and his corruption. Let him bring everything he had. Grant Holloway had survived the war. He'd survived Eleanor's death. He'd survived 10 years of guilt and isolation. He would survive this too. They would survive this too, together. The days that followed Vernon's visit were strange ones, suspended between normalcy and waiting for the other shoe to drop. Grant worked the ranch as always, mending fences and tending livestock, but now with a rifle always within arm's reach. Lydia slowly regained her strength, moving from room to room with increasing steadiness, though Grant noticed how she'd freeze at every unexpected sound, every distant dust cloud on the horizon. And Rosie clung to them both like a burr, as if physical proximity could ward off the dangers she sensed circling. It was Lydia who first suggested the apothecary. Grant found her one morning in the barn, examining his meager collection of medical supplies with a critical eye. She'd found an old crate and was sorting through dried herbs, liniments, and the random detritus of frontier medicine with the focused intensity of someone who needed a purpose beyond waiting. "Most of this is expired or improperly stored," she said without preamble. "The willow bark is still good, but this salve has separated and I don't even know what this is supposed to be." She held up a jar of something that might have been green once, but was now an alarming shade of brown. "I make do with what I have," Grant said mildly. "You could make do with better." Lydia set the jar down with more force than necessary. "I was trained for this, Grant. Before Vernon, before James even, I knew medicine. I was good at it. And now I'm sitting in your house like some delicate flower waiting to be rescued when I could be doing something useful." Grant leaned against the barn door, studying her. The fever flush had left her cheeks, replaced by natural color. The shadows under her eyes had faded. She was still too thin, still carried the marks of her ordeal, but there was steel in her spine again, determination in the set of her jaw. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we stop waiting for Vernon to destroy us and start building something he can't touch." Lydia gestured around the barn. "This space, it's wasted on storage. We could clean it out, set up proper work tables, hang herbs to dry. I could make remedies, tonics, medicines, real ones properly prepared. The kind people around here need and probably can't get without traveling to Tucson." "That's a business," Grant said slowly. "Yes, a legitimate business in my name, in our names, that generates income, provides a service, and most importantly establishes me as a contributing member of this community rather than some helpless woman who needs her child taken away." Lydia's eyes blazed with the kind of fire Grant was beginning to realize had always been there, just buried under layers of fear and exhaustion. "Vernon's arguing I'm unstable, unfit. What better way to prove him wrong than by building something productive?" Grant considered this. Vernon had money and lawyers, but public opinion still mattered, especially in frontier territories where communities were tight-knit and suspicious of outsiders throwing their weight around. A woman running a successful medical practice, providing essential services to her neighbors, would be a lot harder to paint as mentally unfit than a desperate widow hiding on an isolated ranch. You'd need supplies, he said. Proper equipment. Word would need to spread that you're open for business. I'd need an initial investment, Lydia corrected, which I can provide from my own funds, assuming Vernon hasn't completely frozen my access to James's estate. And word spreads fast in small communities. 1 or 2 successful treatments and people will come. Vernon might see it as another challenge, another thing to crush. Then let him try, Lydia said fiercely. I'm tired of running Grant. I'm tired of being afraid. You gave me safety by marrying me. Now let me give us both security by being more than just a woman you rescued. Let me be a partner. The word hung between them. Partner. Not just wife in name, not just protected dependent, but genuine partner. Equal. Contributing. Grant found himself smiling. All right, let's build your apothecary. The transformation of the barn's corner happened quickly once they committed to it. Grant cleared out years of accumulated junk while Lydia sketched plans on scraps of paper, her medical training reasserting itself as she listed equipment needed, herbs to cultivate, remedies to prepare. Rosie helped in her own way, sweeping the floor with a broom twice her size and declaring herself the best helper in the whole territory. They made a trip to Miller's Crossing 3 days later, Lydia's first time back since the wedding. Grant watched her walk into the general store with her head held high, her list of medical supplies held like a declaration of intent. Mrs. S. Chen raised her eyebrows at the quantities of herbs, tinctures, and equipment Lydia requested, but her expression shifted to respect as Lydia explained each item's purpose in precise medical terminology. You know your medicines, Mrs. Chen observed. I was trained as a nurse, Lydia said simply, before I married. Now I'm resuming that training in a practical capacity. News spread, as Grant had known it would. By the time they finished loading their purchases into the wagon, half the town seemed to know that Grant Holloway's new wife was setting up some kind of medical practice. The reactions varied: curiosity, skepticism, a few outright dismissive comments about women practicing medicine. But there was also interest. Frontier life was hard on bodies, and proper medical care was scarce. It was Sheriff Fletcher who approached them as they were preparing to leave. Heard you're starting a medicine business, he said without preamble. Word travels fast, Lydia replied. Always does. Look, I'll be straight with you both. There's been talk. Lawyers from Phoenix asking questions, money changing hands, people being encouraged to remember things about Mrs. Holloway, that paint her in a poor light. Fletcher's expression was grim. Vernon Rusk is building a case, and he's being thorough about it. How thorough? Grant asked. Witnesses claiming they saw Mrs. Marsh behaving erratically before she fled. Testimony from Rusk family employees about unstable behavior. Even got someone claiming she threatened violence against Vernon. Fletcher held up a hand as Lydia started to protest. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying that's what's being compiled. And when it goes before a judge, even an honest judge, that kind of coordinated testimony carries weight. So we're going to lose, Lydia said flatly. Not necessarily. See, the thing about bought testimony is that it's often too perfect, too coordinated, doesn't have the messiness of truth. Fletcher glanced at the supplies in the wagon. But if you can show the court a different picture, a woman actively contributing to her community, providing essential services, behaving in every way like a stable, productive citizen, that creates doubt, and doubt is your friend in court. Grant understood. You're saying the apothecary isn't just a business, it's evidence. I'm saying everything you do from now until that court date, and there will be a court date, mark my words, is evidence one way or another. So make it good evidence. Fletcher tipped his hat. For what it's worth, I'm on your side. War veterans look out for each other, and I never did trust men who buy judges. The ride home was quiet, each of them processing Fletcher's warning in their own way. Rosie fell asleep against her mother's shoulder, exhausted by the day's excitement. Lydia stared out at the passing landscape with distant eyes. He's right, she said finally. Everything we do now is being watched, judged, compiled into whatever case Vernon's building. We can't just live. We have to perform living. Then we perform, Grant said. And we make damn sure the performance is good enough to convince a judge that you're exactly what you are, a good mother and a capable woman who deserves to keep her child. What if it's not enough? Grant didn't have an answer for that, so instead he reached across and took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way home in silence, holding on to each other like lifelines in a storm that hadn't even fully hit yet. The apothecary took shape over the following weeks. Lydia threw herself into the work with single-minded intensity, preparing tinctures and salves, drying herbs in careful bundles, organizing her workspace with the precision of someone who'd been trained in proper medical protocols. Grant built shelves and work tables, reinforced the barn's structure, and watched his wife transform from frightened refugee into something he could only describe as formidable. Their first customer arrived on a Tuesday morning, a rancher's wife from 3 miles south with a child suffering from a persistent cough. Lydia examined the boy with gentle competence, asked detailed questions about symptoms and duration, then prepared a honey-based syrup with horehound and thyme. Give him a spoonful 3 times daily, she instructed. Keep him warm and hydrated. If the cough worsens or he develops a fever, bring him back immediately. The woman paid with eggs and a promise to spread the word. 3 days later, she returned to report the cough had cleared, and she brought 2 neighbors with their own ailments. Then came a cowboy with an infected cut, a pregnant woman seeking prenatal advice, an old prospector with rheumatism. Word spread faster than Grant had anticipated. Lydia's medical knowledge was real and her treatments effective, and in a territory starved for proper health care, that was worth more than gold. Within a month, people were riding from as far as 20 miles away to consult with the medicine woman at the Holloway Ranch. Grant watched his wife bloom under the work and the respect it brought. Watched Rosie help her mama prepare remedies, learning the names of herbs and their uses with the quick memory of childhood. Watched his empty ranch become something alive and purposeful, filled with visiting patients and grateful customers, and the quiet satisfaction of useful work being done. He also watched the horizon for Vernon Rusk's next move, because men like Vernon didn't give up, and the longer the silence stretched, the more dangerous it felt. The storm finally broke 6 weeks after the wedding. Grant was in the barn with Lydia, helping her prepare a large batch of willow bark tea for a neighboring ranch, where several workers had come down with fever when they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Not the casual pace of customers, but the purposeful rhythm of men on official business. "Take Rosie into the house," Grant said quietly. "Lock the doors. Don't come out until I say." Lydia's face went pale, but she moved immediately, calling for Rosie and herding her daughter inside. Grant checked his rifle, loaded, as always, and walked out to meet whatever was coming. It was a delegation. Sheriff Fletcher at the front, looking deeply uncomfortable. Edmund Price beside him, looking triumphant. And behind them, 4 armed deputies Grant didn't recognize, their badges marking them as coming from Phoenix rather than Miller's Crossing. "Grant," Fletcher said, and his tone carried apology. "I've got court orders. From Judge Morrison in Phoenix. I'm legally required to serve them." "What kind of orders?" Grant asked, though he already knew. Could see it in Price's satisfied smirk and Fletcher's reluctance. Fletcher dismounted and handed over several folded documents. Grant read them with growing fury that he forced down into cold calculation. The orders declared Lydia Marsh Holloway mentally unfit based on testimony from multiple witnesses and the evaluation of Dr. Harold Crane. They granted temporary custody of Rosie Marsh to Vernon Rusk as next of kin pending a full hearing, and they ordered Lydia to surrender the child immediately or face criminal charges for contempt of court and custodial interference. "This is signed by Judge Morrison," Grant said. "The same judge you told me was in Vernon's pocket." "Doesn't matter if he's in someone's pocket," Price interjected smoothly. "His signature is legal and binding. The child needs to be turned over. Now." "And if we refuse?" Grant asked. "Then you'll both be arrested," Price said. "You for aiding custodial interference, her for defying a direct court order. Your ranch will be searched, the child will be taken by force if necessary, and you'll both spend considerable time in a Phoenix jail cell while Vernon gets to know his niece better. Is that really what you want?" Grant looked at Fletcher. "Sam?" "I hate this," Fletcher said quietly. "But the law is the law. I can give you an hour to gather the child's things, to say goodbye, but then I have to enforce this order or I'm in contempt myself. An hour. 60 minutes to figure out how to save Rosie from being handed over to the man who'd probably murdered her father and had systematically tried to destroy her mother. Grant's mind raced through options, discarding them as fast as they appeared. Run, but where? Vernon's reach extended across the territory. Fight. But that would make them criminals and give Vernon exactly the justification he needed. Appeal, but to whom? The legal system was rigged. Can I speak with my wife? Grant asked. Privately? You have an hour, Price said. Use it however you want. But at the end of that hour, the child comes with us or you both go to jail. Your choice. Grant walked back to the house feeling like he was walking through water. Everything slow and thick and wrong. He knocked on the door. It's me. Let me in. Lydia opened the door. Rosie clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She didn't ask what the orders said. She could see it in Grant's expression. They're taking her, she whispered. Aren't they? They have a court order, signed by a judge, legal and binding. Grant's voice came out flat, dead. We have an hour before they enforce it. An hour, Lydia repeated. Then, with terrible calm, no. Lydia, no. She said it louder now, fierce and final. I didn't survive the desert, didn't marry you, didn't build a new life just to hand my daughter over to the man who murdered her father. I won't do it, Grant. I'll die first. If you resist, they'll arrest you, both of us, and they'll take Rosie anyway while we rot in a Phoenix jail with no way to protect her. Then what do we do? Lydia's voice cracked. Tell me, Grant. Tell me how we fight this. Grant looked down at Rosie, who was staring up at him with those huge blue eyes full of trust and terror. His stepdaughter, his responsibility. The child he'd promised to protect no matter what. The child he was about to fail, just like he'd failed Eleanor. No, not like Eleanor. He'd been helpless then, a medic with insufficient tools and knowledge to fight an infection that had been beyond his skills. But this wasn't infection. This was human evil, human corruption. And humans could be fought. The idea came to him fully formed, desperate, and possibly insane, but better than surrender. Get your medical bag, Grant said. Your license papers from your nursing training if you still have them. Every record you've kept of treatments here at the apothecary. Every testimony from satisfied patients. Everything that proves you're competent and stable. Why? Grant, we have an hour. We're not giving them Rosie, but we're also not running or fighting. We're going to play their game. Grant was already moving, pulling out paper and pen. We're going to that hearing, right now, today, and we're going to force Judge Morrison to make his ruling in open court where people can see exactly how corrupt he is. They'll never allow that, Lydia said. Vernon wants this done quietly, behind closed doors where he controls everything, which is exactly why we do it publicly. Grant was writing furiously now, crafting what he hoped was legal language. Sam Fletcher's out there. He's honest, even if he has to follow corrupt orders. We demand an immediate emergency hearing based on new evidence. We demand it be held in Miller's Crossing instead of Phoenix. We make enough noise that Vernon can't just quietly take Rosie and disappear her into his estate. That could work, Lydia said slowly, if Fletcher agrees. If we can gather enough community support. If the judge actually shows up instead of just having us arrested. Big ifs, Grant agreed. But they're better than nothing, and right now, nothing is the only other option we have. He finished writing and strode back outside, Lydia and Rosie right behind him. Fletcher was standing apart from Price and the Phoenix deputies, looking miserable. Sam, Grant called, I'm invoking my right to an emergency judicial review of this custody order, based on new evidence of witness tampering and judicial misconduct. I'm demanding an immediate hearing here in Miller's Crossing with proper legal representation. Price laughed. That's not how this works, Holloway. You don't get to demand hearings. You follow the court order or face consequences. Actually, Fletcher said slowly, Arizona territory law does allow for emergency reviews when there's credible evidence of procedural misconduct. It's rarely invoked, but it's legal. He looked at Grant. You have evidence of misconduct? I have testimony from multiple community members about Price here offering money for damaging statements about my wife. I have medical records proving Lydia's competency. I have proof that Dr. Crane, who declared her unfit, has never actually examined her and is on Vernon Rusk's personal payroll. Grant held out the documents he'd prepared. And I'm willing to swear to all of it under oath in open court where everyone can see exactly how Vernon Rusk operates. Price's expression went ugly. This is absurd. Sheriff Fletcher, you have your orders. I have orders to serve a custody transfer, Fletcher interrupted, but I also have a responsibility to ensure legal procedures are followed correctly. If there's credible evidence of misconduct, I'm obligated to allow for proper review. He looked at Grant, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. You're asking for a public hearing, today. Right now, Grant confirmed, in Miller's Crossing, with proper witnesses and public attendance. Let everyone see how legitimate these orders really are. Judge Morrison will never agree, Price sputtered. Then we'll see what people think about a judge who refuses to defend his own rulings in public, Grant said. Makes him look like he has something to hide, doesn't it? Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating. Then he nodded slowly. All right, I'll allow a 2-hour delay in the custody transfer to arrange for an emergency hearing. If Judge Morrison refuses to attend or validate his orders publicly, I'll consider that grounds to question their legitimacy. Mr. Price, I suggest you send word to Phoenix immediately. This is outrageous, Price's face had gone purple. You can't. Vernon will have your badge for this. Maybe he will, Fletcher said, but I swore an oath to uphold the law, not to be Vernon Rusk's errand boy. Now you've got 2 hours. I suggest you use them. The makeshift courtroom was the saloon in Miller's Crossing, hastily cleared of its usual clientele and arranged with tables and chairs approximating judicial formality. Word had spread with the speed of wildfire, and by the time Judge Morrison arrived, 2 hours later, looking furious, the room was packed with curious townspeople, patients Lydia had treated, neighboring ranchers, and anyone else who wanted to witness the spectacle. Morrison was exactly what Grant had expected, a florid man in his 50s with expensive clothes and the entitled bearing of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. He took a seat at the head table with visible irritation, glaring at Grant and Lydia where they sat across from Price and his assistants. This is highly irregular, Morrison began. I'm told there are accusations of procedural misconduct. Let me be clear, my orders are legally sound and will be enforced. This hearing is a formality only. Then proving their legitimacy should be simple, Grant said. He stood, feeling every eye in the room on him. Your Honor, I'm Grant Holloway. This is my wife, Lydia Marsh Holloway. We're here to contest the custody order issued regarding her daughter, Rosie, on the grounds that it's based on falsified testimony, improper medical evaluation, and judicial bias due to the influence of Vernon Rusk. Morrison's expression hardened. Those are serious accusations. Yes, sir, they are, which is why I'm prepared to prove them. Grant pulled out his carefully organized documents. First, the testimony compiled against my wife. According to these orders, multiple witnesses claimed she behaved erratically and unstably prior to fleeing Phoenix. I have here sworn statements from those same witnesses admitting they were paid by Edmund Price, acting on Vernon Rusk's behalf, to provide damaging testimony regardless of truth. He handed the documents to Fletcher, who passed them to Morrison. The judge scanned them, his expression unchanging. Allegations of payment don't invalidate testimony, Morrison said. Perhaps not, but systematic bribery of witnesses does call their credibility into question. Grant pulled out more papers. Second, the medical evaluation by Dr. Harold Crane. Dr. Crane declared my wife mentally unfit based on her behavior. However, Dr. Crane has never personally examined Mrs. Holloway. His evaluation is based entirely on secondhand reports from Vernon Rusk and cannot be considered legitimate medical opinion. Dr. Crane is a respected physician. Who's on Vernon Rusk's personal payroll? Grant interrupted. I have documentation showing regular payments from the Rusk estate to Dr. Crane dating back years. His evaluation isn't independent medical opinion, it's paid advocacy. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Morrison's face reddened. Even if true, that doesn't prove the evaluation is false. No, but this does. Lydia stood, her voice clear and steady. Your Honor, I was trained as a nurse before my marriage. I've maintained detailed medical records since establishing my apothecary practice 6 weeks ago. Records showing successful diagnosis and treatment of over 40 patients from across the territory. Records that demonstrate clear, rational thinking and professional competence. I'm prepared to have any independent physician examine both me and my work to verify my mental fitness. She laid out her carefully maintained patient logs, her treatment notes, her correspondence with satisfied patients, the evidence of a functioning, rational mind engaged in complex medical work. Morrison looked at the documents, and Grant saw something flicker in his expression. Not shame exactly, but maybe the realization that his comfortable corruption was being exposed in front of an audience. "The question isn't whether Mrs. Holloway can practice medicine," Morrison said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "The question is whether she's fit to raise a child." "Then let's address that directly," Grant said. "Rosie, would you come up here, please?" Rosie had been sitting with Mrs. Chen, but at Grant's call, she walked to the front of the room. She looked tiny in the crowded space, but she held her head up with the same fierce courage Grant had first seen in the desert. "Rosie," Grant said gently, "can you tell the judge about your Uncle Vernon, about why you and your mama ran away?" Price shot to his feet. "Objection! You can't put a 4-year-old on the stand." "This isn't a formal trial," Fletcher interrupted. "It's a review hearing. The child can speak if she wants to." Rosie looked up at Judge Morrison, those blue eyes steady and clear. "Uncle Vernon is bad," she said simply. "He hurt Mama. He said mean things. He said he'd take me away from her if she didn't do what he wanted. He made Mama cry, so we ran away." "Children misunderstand adult conversations," Morrison said dismissively. "I'm 4, not stupid," Rosie said with unexpected fierceness. "I know when someone's mean. Uncle Vernon was mean. He grabbed Mama's wrist and twisted it until she cried. I saw him. And then we ran because Mama said Uncle Vernon killed my papa, and if we stayed, he'd kill her too." The courtroom erupted. Morrison banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Rosie's testimony, delivered with childish directness, had cut through all the legal maneuvering and bureaucratic manipulation to the simple truth underneath. Vernon Rusk was a dangerous man, and a mother had fled to protect her child from him. "This is absurd," Price shouted over the noise. "The child is clearly coached." "She's clearly terrified," Grant shot back. "And with good reason. Vernon Rusk murdered his own brother to gain control of the estate. Lydia witnessed it. That's why she ran. That's why this whole custody case exists, not because she's unfit, but because she's inconvenient to a murderer who wants what her dead husband left her." "You have no proof of that," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "I have Lydia's testimony about what she saw. I have the suspicious circumstances of James Rusk's death. I have Vernon's immediate and aggressive pursuit of marriage to his brother's widow and custody of his brother's child. I have the systematic legal harassment designed to separate mother and child, rather than help either of them." Grant leaned forward. "And I have this entire community watching you decide whether you're going to uphold justice or continue protecting a murderer because he pays well." The silence that followed was heavy with judgment. Morrison looked around the room, seeing the faces of people he'd lived among for years, people whose respect he'd relied on, people who were now seeing exactly who he was and what he was willing to do for Vernon Rusk's money. "Your Honor," Lydia said quietly into that silence, "I'm not asking you to rule against Vernon without evidence. I'm asking for a fair investigation, a real one, not one controlled by Vernon's money. I'm asking for time to gather proof about my husband's death, and I'm asking that in the meantime, my daughter stay with me and my husband where she's safe, loved, and clearly thriving." Morrison looked at her, at Rosie, at the packed courtroom, at the documents spread before him that proved his corruption in black and white. Grant could see the calculation in his eyes. How much was Vernon Rusk's money worth compared to his reputation, his position, his soul? Finally, Morrison spoke. "I'm ordering a stay of the custody transfer pending full investigation into the circumstances surrounding James Rusk's death. Mrs. Holloway will retain custody of her daughter during this period. If evidence emerges supporting her allegations about Vernon Rusk, all previous orders will be vacated and Mr. Rusk will face appropriate legal consequences." "Your Honor, you can't," Price began. "I can and I have," Morrison said sharply. "These proceedings are concluded. Case dismissed pending further review." The courtroom erupted again, but this time with approval, with relief. Grant felt his knees nearly buckle as the adrenaline that had been holding him upright suddenly drained away. Lydia grabbed his arm, tears streaming down her face, and Rosie launched herself at both of them, wrapping her small arms around whatever she could reach. "We won," Lydia whispered. "Oh God, we actually won." "We bought time," Grant corrected, "but it's enough." Because it was enough. Enough time for a real investigation into James Rusk's death. Enough time for Vernon's corruption to be properly exposed. Enough time for their fragile, desperate family to solidify into something that couldn't be easily broken. Price left the courtroom in furious silence, no doubt headed straight to Vernon with the news of this very public defeat. Fletcher approached them with a rare smile. "That was either brilliance or insanity," he said. "Probably both." "Mostly desperation," Grant admitted. "Whatever it was, it worked. Morrison won't risk reversing himself now, not with this many witnesses to his original ruling, and Vernon's going to have a much harder time making you disappear quietly after this spectacle." Fletcher shook his head. "You made powerful enemies today, Grant, but you made allies too. That counts for something." They rode home as the sun was setting, painting the desert in those shades of purple and gold Grant had once described to Rosie. The little girl sat between them, chattering excitedly about how she'd been very brave in front of the judge, and how Uncle Vernon can't take me now, right, Papa? "Right," Grant confirmed. "Nobody's taking you anywhere." Lydia's hand found his across Rosie's small body, and they held on as Soldier carried them toward the ranch that had somehow become a home over the past 2 months. Behind them, the last light of day illuminated Miller's Crossing, where a community had witnessed the beginning of Vernon Rusk's downfall. Ahead lay the future, uncertain still, but no longer quite so terrifying. The investigation into James Rusk's death took 3 months. 3 months during which Grant and Lydia lived in cautious hope, building their life together while waiting for the final verdict. 3 months during which Lydia's apothecary thrived, her reputation spreading across the territory as the medicine woman who knew her craft. 3 months during which Rosie learned her letters from Grant in the evenings, scratching Mama and Papa onto a fence post with fierce concentration. The evidence accumulated slowly but steadily. Witnesses who'd been too afraid of Vernon before now came forward, emboldened by Morrison's public reversal. A stable hand testified to seeing Vernon near the site where James had died, seeing him pocket a rifle before riding away. The sheriff who'd originally ruled the death accidental admitted under pressure that Vernon had suggested the ruling, had made it clear that other conclusions would be unfortunate. The case built itself through the accumulated weight of small testimonies, each one another nail in Vernon Rusk's coffin of corruption and violence. When the final ruling came through, it was comprehensive and damning. Vernon Rusk was indicted for the murder of his brother James, for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, for witness tampering, and for a dozen other charges accumulated over years of believing his money made him untouchable. The custody order was officially vacated, Lydia declared a fit mother, and the Rusk estate returned to Lydia's full control as James's legal heir. Vernon tried to run. He made it as far as the Mexican border before federal marshals caught him. He'd face trial in Phoenix, likely spend the rest of his life in prison if the evidence held. Justice, after all, even when delayed. Grant stood at the fence line watching the sunset 6 months after finding Lydia and Rosie in the desert. His wife, his real wife now, the boundaries between convenience and genuine partnership having blurred and then disappeared somewhere in the daily work of building a life together, came up beside him. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, thinking about how one random patrol changed everything. "If I'd ridden a different trail that day, if I'd left an hour earlier or later, I never would have found you." "But you did find us," Lydia said. "You heard a child crying in the desert and you stopped. You didn't have to, but you did. That says something about who you are, Grant Holloway." "Maybe it says something about who you made me want to be," Grant countered. Rosie came running from the house, waving something over her head. "Papa, Papa, look, I wrote a whole sentence." She thrust a piece of paper at him, her handwriting wobbly but legible. "My family is Mama and Papa, and me." "That's perfect, sweetheart," Grant said, crouching down to her level. "You're getting so good at writing." "Miss Chen says I'm the smartest student she's ever had," Rosie announced proudly. "And Mama says when I'm bigger I can help in the apothecary. Real helping, not just sweeping." "You already help plenty," Lydia assured her. "Now go wash up for supper. We're having your favorite tonight." Rosie scampered off, leaving Grant and Lydia alone again under the darkening sky. Grant stood, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders, feeling her lean into him with the easy comfort of long familiarity. "You know what I realized today?" Lydia said. "I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy. I didn't think I'd ever feel that again after James died. But here we are." "Here we are," Grant agreed. "Three broken people who somehow made a family." "Not broken," Lydia corrected gently. "Repaired. There's a difference." Grant thought about that, about Eleanor, who he'd failed to save but who'd taught him that some losses never healed. They just became part of who you were. About the war, which had broken something in him, but also given him skills that had saved lives. About the 10 years of isolation that had nearly calcified him into permanent loneliness. About a desperate woman and her daughter who'd trusted him when they had no reason to, who'd given him a purpose beyond mere survival. "Repaired," he said. "I like that better." Later that night, after Rosie was asleep in her small room that Grant had built specially for her, after the dishes were washed and the animals tended and the ranch settled into its evening quiet, Grant stood at the bedroom window looking out at the land he'd chosen for isolation, and that had become the foundation of something he'd never expected to have again. Lydia came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You're thinking again, I can tell." "Thinking about the sign," Grant said. "The one you mentioned last month, for the ranch." "Three hearts, one home," Lydia said. "You said it was too sentimental." "I was wrong. We should make it. Hang it over the gate where everyone can see." Lydia turned him around to face her, and Grant saw in her eyes the same journey they'd both traveled, from desperate strangers to partners to something deeper that neither of them had the words for yet, but both understood. "Grant Holloway," she said softly. "Did you just admit you were wrong about something?" "Don't let it go to your head," he said, but he was smiling. She kissed him, not the chaste kiss of their wedding, but something real and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Grant rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me, for marrying me, for making this empty place a home." "Thank you for stopping when you heard a child crying," Lydia replied, "for being the man who saves people when it matters most, for being exactly who Rosie and I needed." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the darkness, two people who'd fled their own demons and found redemption in each other's desperate need. Outside, the desert stretched away under stars that seemed close enough to touch, and somewhere in that vast emptiness, other people were fighting their own battles, facing their own fears, hoping for their own salvation. But here, in this ranch house that had been empty for so long and was now filled with life and laughter and purpose, three hearts had found their home. And that, Grant thought as he held his wife close, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The next morning, Grant started building the sign while Rosie supervised with serious intensity and Lydia worked in the apothecary, her voice drifting through the open barn door as she explained herbal properties to a visiting patient. He carved the words carefully into good oak wood, each letter precise and permanent. The Holloways, three hearts, one home. When it was finished, he hung it over the gate with Lydia and Rosie watching. The little girl clapped her hands with delight. "Now everyone will know," she declared. "Now everyone will know we're a real family." "We've been a real family since the moment your papa found us in the desert," Lydia said, meeting Grant's eyes with a smile that made his heart do strange things in his chest. "Since before that, maybe," Grant said. "We just didn't know it yet." He stood back, looking at the sign swaying gently in the desert breeze, at his wife and daughter standing beside him, at the ranch that had transformed from refuge into home. The desert had nearly killed them all, but instead, it had brought them together, had forged them in heat and desperation and desperate hope into something stronger than any of them had been alone. Three hearts, one home. A family built not from tradition or expectation, but from choice and courage and the simple act of one man stopping when he heard a child cry. Grant Holloway had spent 10 years believing he was done saving lives, done taking chances, done hoping for anything beyond survival. He'd been wrong. And for once in his life, being wrong had led him exactly where he needed to be. Home.